Long before Rome emerged as a city, and centuries before the Etruscans formed their first urban centers, central Italy was already embedded within networks of migration, exchange, and cultural experimentation that linked the Western Mediterranean to the Aegean world. Between approximately 1800 and 1200 BCE, the Italian peninsula existed not as a unified cultural or political entity, but as a mosaic of regional societies shaped by geography, climate, and access to resources. Central Italy, later known as Etruria, was dominated by rolling hills, river valleys such as the Arno and Tiber, and a coastline that opened toward the Tyrrhenian Sea. These environmental conditions favored small, dispersed communities rather than centralized states. Archaeological evidence from this period indicates a landscape occupied by village-based societies, each adapted to its immediate surroundings and operating largely independently of one another. Archaeologists classify much of this era under the broad umbrella of the Apennine culture, a term used to describe Middle and Late Bronze Age populations across much of Italy. Excavations reveal settlements composed primarily of circular or oval huts, constructed with wooden frames, wattle and daub walls, and thatched roofs. These structures, identified at sites such as Luni sul Mignone and in the Alban Hills, suggest modest population sizes and limited architectural differentiation. There is little evidence for monumental construction, administrative buildings, or permanent elite residences, indicating the absence of formal political hierarchies. Material culture reinforces this picture of decentralized social organization. Pottery assemblages from the period are predominantly handmade and undecorated, with functional forms designed for storage and cooking rather than display. While regional variations in shape and clay composition are visible, there is no indication of standardized production on an interregional scale. This fragmentation suggests that identity was local rather than collective, rooted in kinship groups or village-level communities rather than broader ethnic or political affiliations. Burial practices further illustrate this social structure. Cemeteries from the Middle and Late Bronze Age typically contain simple inhumation graves, often lacking significant grave goods. Where metal objects appear, such as bronze pins, knives, or small ornaments, they are limited in number and unevenly distributed. Records indicate no consistent funerary differentiation that would suggest hereditary elites or centralized authority. Instead, status distinctions appear minimal and situational, reinforcing the interpretation of relatively egalitarian social systems. Despite this internal fragmentation, central Italy was not isolated. Archaeologists uncovered clear evidence of long-distance exchange networks connecting the peninsula to the wider Mediterranean. Mycenaean-style pottery fragments, dating primarily to the 14th to 12th centuries BCE, have been found at coastal and inland sites, including Lipari, Pundamelliso, and the Po Valley. These imports, alongside locally produced imitations, indicate contact, direct or indirect, with Aegean traders. Such exchanges likely involved metals, agricultural products, and possibly enslaved individuals, though organic goods rarely survive archaeologically. The presence of these networks demonstrates an important interpretive insight. Economic connectivity preceded political complexity. While communities remained small and autonomous, they participated in systems of exchange that transmitted technologies, ideas, and prestige goods across vast distances. This interaction laid the groundwork for later social differentiation by introducing external models of status and wealth accumulation, even if those models were not yet institutionalized. Metallurgy represents a second critical factor shaping the pre-Etruscan environment. Central Italy possessed access to copper, tin, and iron resources, particularly in regions later dominated by Etruscan cities. Bronze tools and weapons from this period display increasing technical sophistication, suggesting specialized knowledge within certain communities. However, production remained small-scale and localized. There is no evidence for centralized control over metal resources, a condition that would change significantly in the early Iron Age. Geography also imposed constraints that discouraged early political consolidation. The Apennine mountain chain fragmented communication routes, while dense forests and marshlands limited overland mobility. Rivers facilitated local exchange but did not yet function as integrated commercial arteries. As a result, Power remained geographically constrained, and no single group possessed the capacity to dominate large territories. A second interpretive insight emerges here. The lack of early centralization was not a failure of development, but an adaptation to environmental realities. Societies organized themselves efficiently around subsistence agriculture, seasonal pastoralism, and limited trade, without the administrative burdens associated with early states. This flexibility allowed communities to persist through climatic fluctuations and regional disruptions, including the broader Late Bronze Age collapse that affected much of the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE. By the end of the Late Bronze Age, however, subtle shifts were underway. Settlement patterns began to change, with populations gradually concentrating in more defensible and resource-rich locations. Burial customs evolved toward greater differentiation, and metal objects became more prominent in ritual contexts. These developments did not yet constitute an Etruscan civilization, but they marked the structural preconditions for its emergence. By c. 1200 BCE, central Italy remained politically fragmented but economically connected, technologically capable, and environmentally primed for transformation. These conditions did not produce immediate state formation, but they established the foundations upon which a new and distinct culture would soon take shape. As these Bronze Age communities transitioned into the early Iron Age, continuity rather than disruption would guide the emergence of the cultural patterns later recognized as Etruscan. By the early Iron Age, a new cultural pattern appeared in central Italy, one defined not by abrupt rupture, but by visible transformation in burial customs, metallurgy, and settlement organization. Between approximately 1200 and 800 BCE, the societies of central Italy underwent a gradual but measurable transition that archaeologists identify as the Villanovan culture. Named after a cemetery discovered near Villanova, outside modern Bologna, this cultural horizon represents the earliest archaeological phase conventionally associated with the Etruscans. Rather than signaling the arrival of a new population, Villanovan material remains demonstrates strong continuity with the preceding Late Bronze Age communities, while simultaneously introducing innovations that marked the beginning of a new social order. The most distinctive feature of Villanovan culture is its funerary practice, particularly the widespread adoption of cremation. Human remains were typically burned and placed inside biconical urns, often capped with an inverted bowl or helmet-shaped lid. These urns were deposited in cemeteries located outside settlements, arranged in relatively uniform patterns. Archaeologists uncovered such burial grounds at sites including Tarquinia, Veii, Cerveteri, and Bologna, establishing a consistent cultural footprint across much of Etruria. Grave goods from Villanovan burials provide critical insight into social organization. Objects such as fibulae, razors, weapons, and spindle whorls appear alongside urns, with variation in quantity and quality. While most burials remain modest, some graves contain more elaborate assemblages, suggesting the early emergence of status differentiation. However, there is no evidence of rigid class stratification or royal burials during this phase. Power, where it existed, appears localized and personal rather than institutional. Settlement evidence reinforces the picture of continuity. Villanovan communities often occupied the same hilltop locations as earlier Bronze Age villages, expanding them incrementally rather than founding entirely new centers. Excavations reveal clusters of huts constructed with traditional materials, though layouts became more organized over time. Records indicate no sudden urban planning or monumental architecture, supporting the interpretation that Villanovan society evolved internally rather than through external imposition. Technological change, however, was significant. The Villanovan period coincides with the introduction and widespread use of iron, marking a decisive shift from bronze-based production. Iron tools and weapons appear increasingly in both domestic and funerary contexts. Central Italy's proximity to iron-rich regions, particularly Elba and the Tuscan coast, provided communities with access to this critical resource. This transition improved agricultural efficiency and military capability, setting long-term conditions for economic growth. One interpretive insight emerges clearly from the archaeological record. The Villanovan phase represents structural intensification rather than cultural replacement. Population density increased, craft specialization expanded, and social differentiation became more visible, but these changes occurred within an existing cultural framework. Pottery styles evolved gradually, and domestic architecture retained familiar forms. This continuity challenges earlier migration-based explanations for Etruscan origins. Ancient literary sources complicate the picture. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, famously claimed that the Etruscans originated in Lydia, having migrated to Italy during a famine. In contrast, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, writing under Roman rule, rejected this account and argued for an indigenous Italian origin. Modern scholarship has largely favored Dionysius's position, though with important qualifications. Archaeological evidence does not support a mass migration from Anatolia during this period, nor does it reveal abrupt changes in material culture consistent with population replacement. Linguistic and genetic studies further support a model of local development with external interaction. The Etruscan language, while non-Indo-European, does not require recent Eastern migration to explain its presence. Inscriptions from the later Etruscan period suggest deep regional roots, and genetic analyses of Iron Age remains show continuity with earlier populations of central Italy. These findings reinforce the conclusion that cultural exchange, rather than large-scale migration, best explains external influences visible in Villanovan material culture. A second interpretive insight follows from this debate. Origin myths recorded by Greek authors reflect perception rather than process. Greek observers, encountering an unfamiliar language and customs, interpreted difference through the lens of migration narratives common in ancient historiography. These accounts reveal more about Greek attempts to categorize the Etruscans than about the actual formation of Etruscan society. By the late 9th and early 8th centuries BCE, Villanovan communities exhibited increasing complexity. Burial assemblages grew more elaborate, long-distance trade intensified, and settlement sizes expanded. While political authority remained decentralized, the foundations of later city-states were becoming visible. The Villanovan culture did not disappear abruptly. Instead, it gradually transformed into what archaeologists identify as Orientalizing period Etruscan society, marked by increased contact with the Eastern Mediterranean. By c. 800 BCE, the Villanovan phase had fulfilled its historical role. It established stable settlement patterns, normalized iron technology, and introduced social distinctions that would later solidify into aristocratic rule. These developments did not yet produce cities or states, but they created the institutional and cultural continuity necessary for their emergence. From this foundation of gradual transformation, more complex political communities would soon arise, reshaping the social and territorial organization of central Italy. Geography would define both Etruscan prosperity and vulnerability, shaping where communities formed, how they sustained themselves, and the limits of their political power. The territory later known as Etruria occupied a strategically significant region of central Italy, bounded by the Tyrrhenian Sea to the west, the Apennine Mountains to the east, and intersected by fertile river valleys. This landscape imposed both opportunities and constraints that directly influenced early settlement patterns during the Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age. Archaeological surveys demonstrate that human occupation clustered where agricultural potential, defensibility, and access to trade converged, rather than being evenly distributed across the region. The most prominent feature of early Etruscan settlement was the preference for elevated plateaus and hilltops. Sites such as Tarquinia, Veii, Cerveteri, and Vulci were established on naturally defensible tufa plateaus overlooking river systems or coastal plains. Excavations reveal that these locations were not selected arbitrarily. Elevated terrain provided security against small-scale conflict, while proximity to water sources enabled agriculture and transport. Records indicate that many of these sites had been intermittently occupied since the Bronze Age, reinforcing patterns of long-term continuity rather than sudden relocation. Surrounding these hilltop centers were fertile lowlands, particularly in the valleys of the Tiber, Fiora, and Marta rivers. Soil analysis and paleoenvironmental studies suggest that these plains were well suited to cereal cultivation, viticulture, and animal husbandry. Archaeologists uncovered storage pits, grinding stones, and agricultural tools at early settlement sites, indicating surplus production. This agricultural base supported population growth and reduced reliance on seasonal mobility, allowing communities to become more permanently rooted. A critical economic factor in early Etruscan development was access to metal resources, especially iron. The island of Elba, located off the Tuscan coast, contains some of the richest iron deposits in the western Mediterranean. Archaeological evidence from slag heaps and smelting sites along the mainland coast demonstrates that Elban iron was extracted, processed, and distributed across Etruria as early as the 9th century BCE. This resource provided Etruscan communities with durable tools, weapons, and trade goods, contributing directly to their economic resilience. One interpretive insight arises from this pattern. Control over resource corridors mattered more than territorial extent. Early Etruscan settlements did not dominate vast hinterlands, but they positioned themselves to oversee rivers, coastal access points, and routes linking inland and maritime zones. This strategic placement allowed relatively small communities to exert disproportionate economic influence, particularly in metal exchange and agricultural surplus. Trade indicators reinforce this interpretation. Archaeologists uncovered imported ceramics, amber, and bronze objects at several early sites, suggesting participation in exchange networks that extended beyond Italy. While the volume of trade remained limited during this early phase, its geographic reach was significant. Coastal settlements such as Veii and Tarquinia show early evidence of contact with Phoenician and Greek traders, facilitated by natural harbors and navigable coastal waters. These connections would intensify in later centuries but were already shaping settlement hierarchies. Environmental diversity within Etruria also contributed to regional differentiation. Northern areas closer to the Apennines favored pastoralism and woodland exploitation, while southern zones emphasized agriculture and maritime activity. Archaeological surveys reveal variations in settlement density, burial customs, and material culture across these subregions. This diversity limited political unification but encouraged economic specialization, allowing different communities to interact through complementary production rather than centralized control. A second interpretive insight follows. Geographic fragmentation discouraged early state formation while enabling economic interdependence. Natural barriers, rivers, ridges, and forests restricted large-scale political integration, but they did not prevent exchange. Instead, they fostered a network of semi-autonomous communities linked by trade and shared cultural practices. This structure would later shape the distinctive city-state model of Etruscan political organization. By the late 9th and early 8th centuries BCE, settlement size and complexity began to increase. Excavations at sites like Veii reveal expanded habitation zones, more regularized layouts, and evidence of communal planning. While still lacking monumental architecture, these centers displayed the demographic and economic thresholds necessary for urban development. Agricultural intensification, facilitated by iron tools, supported these changes by increasing productivity and stability. The landscape that sustained early Etruscan society also imposed long-term vulnerabilities. Reliance on specific resource zones made communities sensitive to external pressure, particularly from rival powers seeking access to trade routes and metals. Coastal exposure brought opportunity but also conflict, as maritime contact introduced competition alongside exchange. By the end of this formative period, Etruscan settlements had established enduring relationships with their environment. Geography did not determine outcomes in isolation, but it shaped the parameters within which social and political systems evolved. Hilltop centers, fertile plains, and access to iron combined to produce stable, interconnected communities poised for further transformation. From these geographically anchored settlements, increasingly organized political communities would emerge, laying the groundwork for the rise of Etruscan city-states. By the 8th century BCE, cultural uniformity began to emerge across Etruria, visible not in political unification, but in shared language, ritual practice, and material expression. Between approximately 800 and 700 BCE, communities across central Italy entered a phase of cultural consolidation that historians describe as Etruscan ethnogenesis, the gradual formation of a recognizable and shared identity. This process did not involve the creation of a centralized state or the disappearance of local variation. Instead, it reflected the alignment of linguistic, religious, and social practices across a broad geographic area. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence from this period demonstrates increasing coherence in how communities represented themselves and interacted with one another. The most definitive marker of Etruscan identity is language. During this century, inscriptions appear that can be securely identified as written in Etruscan, a language distinct from the Indo-European tongues spoken by neighboring Italic peoples. Early examples include short ownership inscriptions incised on pottery, weapons, and votive objects, using an alphabet derived from Greek models, likely transmitted through contacts with Euboean settlers in southern Italy. Archaeologists uncovered early inscriptions at sites such as Veii, Tarquinia, and Cerveteri, confirming widespread adoption rather than localized experimentation. The emergence of a shared written language carried significant social implications. Literacy, though limited to elites and ritual specialists, enabled the standardization of names, titles, and religious terminology. This development facilitated communication across communities and reinforced the perception of belonging to a broader cultural group. One interpretive insight follows directly. Language functioned as a unifying framework in the absence of political centralization. While Etruscan cities remained autonomous, the shared use of language allowed elites to recognize one another as participants in a common cultural system. Religious practice provides a second pillar of emerging identity. Archaeological evidence indicates the widespread adoption of similar ritual structures, divinities, and sacred spaces during this period. Sanctuaries dedicated to gods later known as Tinia, Uni, and Minerva appear across Etruria, suggesting a shared pantheon, even if local cult practices varied. Votive deposits containing ceramics, metal figurines, and weapons show consistent ritual patterns, reinforcing the idea of common religious expectations. Records indicate that religious authority played a central role in shaping social cohesion. Priestly specialists interpreted divine signs through standardized methods of augury and divination, practices that would later be formalized in Etruscan religious doctrine. The early spread of these practices suggests that belief systems were already functioning as a shared cultural language, linking communities through ritual obligation rather than political command. This supports a second interpretive insight. Religion served as an integrative force that preceded institutional governance. Material culture further reflects this convergence. Pottery styles across Etruria during the late 8th century BCE show increasing uniformity in form and decoration. While regional workshops retained distinct traits, the overall aesthetic moved toward shared conventions. Burial customs also became more standardized, with cremation and urn burial remaining dominant, but accompanied by increasingly elaborate grave goods that followed similar patterns across multiple sites. These shared practices reinforced social norms and elite identities recognizable beyond individual settlements. At the same time, ethnogenesis did not erase local diversity. Settlement organization, architectural forms, and economic focus continued to vary according to geography and resources. Coastal communities engaged more directly with Mediterranean trade, while inland centers emphasized agriculture and regional exchange. This coexistence of unity and diversity is central to understanding Etruscan identity. It was cultural rather than political, maintained through shared symbols and practices rather than enforced authority. Ancient literary sources, though written centuries later, provide indirect confirmation of this cultural coherence. Greek authors consistently refer to the inhabitants of Etruria as a distinct people, despite their political fragmentation. While these accounts are shaped by external perception, they reflect a reality already visible in the archaeological record by the 8th century BCE. Importantly, these sources do not describe a recent migration or conquest, aligning with modern archaeological conclusions that identity emerged internally. A third interpretive insight arises here. Etruscan identity was constructed through interaction, not isolation. Contact with Greek and Phoenician traders introduced writing systems, artistic motifs, and religious concepts, but these elements were selectively adapted rather than passively adopted. The resulting culture was neither wholly indigenous nor imported, but a synthesis shaped by long-term regional development. By the end of the 8th century BCE, this shared identity had tangible consequences. Communities increasingly recognized common religious calendars, ritual obligations, and elite markers. These shared frameworks reduced friction between neighboring settlements and enabled coordinated activity, including trade agreements and collective religious gatherings. While political authority remained localized, the foundations for more complex organization were firmly in place. The formation of Etruscan identity during this period did not produce immediate urbanization or state formation. However, it created the cultural infrastructure necessary for those developments. Language standardized communication, religion structured authority, and shared customs reinforced elite networks across Etruria. These elements transformed a collection of related communities into a recognizable civilization. This shared cultural identity enabled more complex political organization, allowing Etruscan settlements to expand, coordinate, and eventually develop into autonomous city-states. Urbanization marked a decisive shift in Etruscan society, transforming loosely connected communities into structured centers of population, authority, and economic coordination. During the late 8th and 7th centuries BCE, Etruria experienced a process of urban concentration that fundamentally altered its social and political landscape. Villages that had long occupied defensible hilltops expanded outward and inward simultaneously, consolidating population into larger, more permanent settlements. Archaeological evidence from major sites such as Tarquinia, Cerveteri, Caira, Veii, Vulci, and Orvieto indicates that this transformation was gradual but systematic, driven by demographic growth, economic specialization, and elite consolidation rather than sudden political reform. Excavations reveal that these emerging cities developed from earlier Villanova nuclei. At Tarquinia, for example, habitation spread across the Monterazzi Plateau, while nearby cemeteries expanded in size and complexity. At Cerveteri, the shift is visible in the organization of settlement zones and necropolis, notably the Banditacha Cemetery, which began to reflect increasingly structured spatial planning. These developments demonstrate that urbanization was not imposed from outside but evolved organically from existing settlement patterns. One of the defining features of early Etruscan urbanization was population concentration. Archaeologists estimate that by the 7th century BCE, some Etruscan centers housed several thousand inhabitants, far exceeding the scale of earlier villages. This concentration supported craft specialization, including metallurgy, pottery production, and textile manufacture. Workshops identified within settlement areas suggest organized production intended not only for local consumption but also for exchange within and beyond Etruria. Monumental architecture provides further evidence of this shift. Although early Etruscan buildings were constructed primarily from perishable materials, foundations, post holes, and roof tiles indicate the emergence of large communal and elite structures. The introduction of tiled roofs, replacing thatch, marks both technological advancement and symbolic display. Temple foundations and public spaces, while still modest compared to later periods, suggest the early delineation of civic and religious centers within cities. Elite control played a central role in this transformation. Burial evidence from the 7th century BCE shows a pronounced increase in wealth differentiation. Tombs at sites such as Regalini Galassi near Cerveteri contain imported goods, gold jewelry, and ceremonial objects, indicating the rise of a hereditary aristocracy. These elites likely controlled land, surplus production, and access to trade, using their resources to sponsor construction projects and religious institutions that reinforced their authority. An important interpretive insight emerges here. Urbanization and elite power developed in tandem, each reinforcing the other. Population concentration increased economic output and labor availability, while elite management of surplus enabled investment in infrastructure and ritual display. This reciprocal relationship transformed cities into centers of both production and political influence, even in the absence of formal state institutions. Political organization within these cities remained fluid during this early phase. There is limited evidence for codified laws or bureaucratic administration. Instead, authority appears to have rested with leading families or individuals, later referred to in Roman sources as lucumones, who exercised power through personal influence, religious legitimacy, and control of resources. Councils of elders or aristocrats likely advised these leaders, though their structure remains archaeologically elusive. The spatial organization of early city-states reflects this decentralized authority. Settlements lacked rigid street grids or standardized public buildings, but they did exhibit zones associated with habitation, craft production, ritual, and burial. Natural features such as ravines and plateaus often defined boundaries, reducing the need for constructed fortifications during this period. This reliance on geography underscores how environmental factors continued to shape political development. Trade further accelerated urban growth. By the 7th century BCE, Etruscan cities were deeply embedded in Mediterranean exchange networks, importing Greek pottery, Near Eastern luxury goods, and raw materials while exporting metals, agricultural products, and crafted items. Coastal cities benefited most directly, but inland centers participated through riverine and overland routes. Control over these networks enhanced elite status and increased intercity competition. A second interpretive insight follows. Competition among city-states stimulated internal development rather than unification. Instead of forming a centralized kingdom, Etruscan communities invested in strengthening their own urban centers, fostering a landscape of autonomous but culturally connected cities. This pattern would define Etruscan political organization throughout its history. By the end of the 7th century BCE, the essential characteristics of the Etruscan city-state were in place. Large, permanent populations occupied defined territories. Elites exercised authority through land control, religion, and wealth, and urban centers functioned as hubs of economic and cultural activity. These cities did not yet possess fully developed governmental institutions, but their scale and complexity demanded more formal systems of coordination. These expanding cities required structured systems of governance to manage population, resources, and ritual authority, leading to the development of more defined political institutions. Etruscan unity was religious rather than imperial, expressed through shared ritual obligations instead of centralized political authority. As Etruscan city-states expanded in scale and complexity during the 7th century BCE, mechanisms emerged to coordinate interaction across the region without dissolving local autonomy. Ancient sources and archaeological evidence point to the existence of a religious confederation, conventionally known as the Dodecapolis or League of 12 Cities. This league did not function as a state or empire, but as a framework for ritual coordination, diplomatic contact, and the regulation of shared cultural norms among the leading Etruscan communities. Classical authors, including Livy and Dionysius of Halicarnassus, describe periodic assemblies of Etruscan leaders at a sacred site known as the Fanum Voltumni, dedicated to the god Voltumna. Although the precise location of this sanctuary remains debated, archaeological and textual evidence increasingly supports identification near modern Orvieto. Excavations in the Orvieto area uncovered sanctuaries, votive deposits, and inscriptions consistent with regional religious activity, lending material support to literary accounts. The League of 12 Cities likely included prominent centers such as Tarquinia, Veii, Cerveteri, Vulci, Orvieto, Perugia, Volterra, Chiusi, Arezzo, and Populonia, though membership may have shifted over time. Importantly, the League did not impose binding political decisions or military obligations. Instead, its primary function was ritual, coordinating festivals, sacrifices, and consultations of divine, while that affected the entire Etruscan world. This religious focus had concrete political implications. Participation in shared rituals reinforced elite legitimacy by linking local authority to regional tradition. Leaders who represented their cities at the Fanum Voltumni did so not as sovereign rulers, but as custodians of communal religious order. One interpretive insight follows. The League reinforced hierarchy among cities without erasing independence, allowing dominant centers to assert prestige while smaller communities retained autonomy. Archaeological indicators support this interpretation. Votive offerings found at regional sanctuaries display stylistic diversity, suggesting contributions from multiple cities rather than centralized production. Inscriptions naming individuals and cities further indicate that participation was collective rather than compulsory. These patterns reinforce the view of the League as a forum for coordination rather than command. The absence of centralized political authority within the League reflects deeper structural constraints. Geographic fragmentation, regional economic specialization, and entrenched elite lineages discouraged unification under a single ruler. Unlike empires formed through conquest, the Etruscan world developed through parallel growth among independent cities. Cooperation, therefore, depended on shared belief systems rather than coercive power. A second interpretive insight emerges here. Religion functioned as a substitute for formal political institutions at the regional level. Where bureaucratic administration was absent, ritual consensus provided a means of managing intercity relations. Divination, collective sacrifice, and calendrical coordination offered structured moments for negotiation and alignment, even when political interests diverged. The League may also have served as a venue for resolving disputes and coordinating responses to external threats. While evidence for joint military action is limited, some ancient accounts imply that collective decisions could be discussed at religious gatherings. However, the lack of consistent cooperation during major conflicts, such as wars against Greek or Roman forces, suggests that the League's influence was moral rather than executive. Despite these limitations, the League contributed to cultural cohesion across Etruria. Shared festivals and sanctuaries reinforced common religious language, iconography, and ritual practice. This cohesion facilitated trade, intermarriage among elites, and the circulation of artisans and ideas. Over time, it strengthened the sense of belonging to a broader Etruscan world, even as political fragmentation persisted. The existence of the Dodecapolis also influenced how outsiders perceived the Etruscans. Greek and Roman authors often described them as a single people, despite acknowledging their political divisions. This perception likely arose from the visible consistency of religious practices and the regularity of intercity interaction facilitated by the League. Thus, the League shaped both internal organization and external identity. By the 6th century BCE, the League had become an established feature of Etruscan society, though its exact composition and authority remained fluid. It did not prevent rivalry, warfare, or divergent political trajectories among cities. Nevertheless, it provided a durable framework for cooperation that persisted for centuries, adapting to changing circumstances without transforming into a centralized state. This regional structure, grounded in ritual coordination rather than political command, influenced how authority and governance developed within individual Etruscan cities. Etruscan power rested in elite lineages, expressed through personal authority, ritual legitimacy, and control of land, rather than codified state institutions. From the 7th to the early 5th centuries BCE, political authority within Etruscan city-states developed around a system best described as aristocratic kingship. Unlike later Roman republican governance or Near Eastern monarchies, Etruscan political organization combined individual leadership with collective elite influence. The central figure in this system was the lucumo, plural, lucumones, a term used in Roman sources to denote an Etruscan ruler or king. While the precise scope of lucuminal power varied by city and period, archaeological and textual evidence suggests that authority was personal, ritualized, and embedded within elite families. Roman authors, including Livy and Varro, describe Etruscan kings as holders of both political and religious authority. The lucumo presided over civic rituals, commanded military forces, and represented the city in diplomatic and religious assemblies. Symbols of office, later adopted by Rome, such as the fasces, curule chair, purple-bordered garments, and ceremonial axes, are consistently attributed to Etruscan rulers. These symbols indicate that authority was visually codified, even if legal structures were not formally written. Archaeological evidence reinforces this portrayal. Elite tombs from the Orientalizing and Archaic periods reveal concentrations of wealth that far exceed those of ordinary burials. The Regalini Galassi tomb at Cerveteri, dating to the 7th century BCE, contained gold jewelry, imported luxury goods, ceremonial weapons, and ritual objects. Such assemblages point to individuals who exercised exceptional authority and controlled extensive resources. Importantly, these tombs are associated with family groups rather than isolated rulers, indicating that power was hereditary and lineage-based. This leads to a key interpretive insight. Etruscan kingship functioned within an aristocratic framework rather than above it. Lucumones were not absolute monarchs ruling over passive subjects. They were dominant members of elite clans whose authority depended on consensus, ritual legitimacy, and the support of other aristocratic families. Political stability relied on maintaining balance within this elite class rather than enforcing centralized control. Councils likely played a significant role in governance, though their structure remains archaeologically opaque. Roman sources imply the existence of advisory bodies composed of leading nobles, comparable in function, but not form, to later senates. These councils may have influenced decisions on warfare, treaties, and religious obligations. Their presence suggests that Etruscan governance incorporated collective deliberation alongside individual leadership. Civic authority was closely tied to religion. Etruscan political leaders derived legitimacy from their role as intermediaries between the gods and the community. Divination, sacrifice, and ritual observance were not private acts but public responsibilities of the ruling elite. Failure to interpret divine signs correctly or to perform rituals properly could undermine a leader's authority. This integration of governance and religion ensured that political power was framed as divinely sanctioned rather than merely coercive. A second interpretive insight follows. Religious expertise was a prerequisite for political leadership. Unlike systems where priesthood and rulership were separate, Etruscan elites combined both roles. Mastery of ritual knowledge distinguished ruling families from the broader population and reinforced social hierarchy. This dynamic limited access to power and ensured continuity across generations. The territorial basis of authority further shaped Etruscan political organization. Each city-state controlled a defined hinterland consisting of agricultural land, smaller settlements, and resource zones. Elite families held estates within this territory, managing production and labor. Control over land translated directly into political influence, as surplus supported military equipment, patronage, and public works. Archaeological surveys reveal patterns of rural villas and farmsteads connected to urban centers, indicating structured landholding systems. Military leadership reinforced elite status. Lucumones and aristocrats likely led armies drawn from the citizen population, organized according to wealth and status. Equipment found in elite graves, helmets, spears, shields, demonstrates that military service was closely associated with aristocratic identity. Victory in warfare enhanced prestige and could expand territorial control, further consolidating elite power. However, Etruscan political systems were not static. By the late 6th and early 5th centuries BCE, some cities appear to have reduced or abolished kingship in favor of broader aristocratic governance. Roman tradition attributes this shift to internal tensions and resistance to dynastic rule, a process mirrored in Rome's own transition from monarchy to republic. While Roman accounts must be treated cautiously, archaeological patterns, such as the decline of exceptionally rich royal tombs, suggest real changes in elite power structures. A third interpretive insight emerges here. Etruscan political authority was adaptable rather than rigid. The absence of fixed constitutional forms allowed cities to modify governance in response to internal pressures and external threats. This flexibility supported long-term resilience but also limited the development of centralized institutions capable of coordinating large-scale action across Etruria. By the early 5th century BCE, Etruscan political organization remained rooted in aristocratic dominance, whether expressed through kingship or collective elite rule. Authority was localized, lineage-based, and inseparable from religious practice. While this system supported urban growth and cultural achievement, it also entrenched social divisions that shaped every aspect of civic life. Political authority structured in this way reinforced social stratification, defining clear hierarchies between ruling elites and the broader population within Etruscan cities. Etruscan society was visibly hierarchical, structured around clearly defined social roles that governed access to land, political authority, and cultural expression. By the 6th century BCE, Etruscan cities exhibited a stratified social order in which status was both inherited and publicly displayed. Archaeological, epigraphic, and literary evidence indicates that society was divided into aristocratic elites, free commoners, specialized artisans, and enslaved individuals, each group occupying a distinct position within the civic framework. These divisions were not merely economic. They were embedded in law, religion, and daily practice, shaping how individuals participated in urban life. At the top of the social hierarchy stood the aristocracy, composed of powerful families whose wealth derived from landownership, trade, and control of resources. Elite status was hereditary, reinforced through kinship networks and marriage alliances. Tombs belonging to these families, particularly from the Orientalizing and Archaic periods, display substantial wealth and symbolic objects, gold ornaments, imported goods, weapons, and ceremonial furniture. Inscriptions found on grave goods and monuments record personal names and lineage markers, underscoring the importance of ancestry in maintaining social rank. Aristocrats dominated political and religious institutions. They held magistracies, presided over rituals, and represented their cities in regional assemblies. Citizenship, in the full sense, was closely tied to elite status. While all free inhabitants may have belonged to the community, meaningful political participation remained restricted to those with land, wealth, and ritual authority. This concentration of power ensured continuity within ruling families and limited social mobility. Below the aristocracy were free commoners, who constituted the majority of the population. This group included small landholders, farmers, laborers, and local traders. Commoners contributed to agricultural production, military service, and civic labor, forming the economic backbone of Etruscan cities. Archaeological evidence from modest domestic structures and simpler burials reflects their lower status, though they retained personal freedom and legal recognition within the community. Military service appears to have functioned as a primary obligation and potential avenue for limited advancement among commoners. Grave goods from non-elite burials occasionally include weapons, indicating participation in warfare. However, the absence of monumental tombs or luxury items suggests that such service rarely translated into lasting social elevation. One interpretive insight emerges here. Etruscan society allowed participation without equality, integrating commoners into civic life while preserving aristocratic dominance. Artisans occupied a distinct and increasingly important social category. Specialized producers, metalworkers, potters, sculptors, and builders played a crucial role in urban economies. Workshops identified at sites such as Veii and Tarquinia reveal organized production zones, sometimes located near elite residences or sanctuaries. While some artisans were free individuals, others may have worked under aristocratic patronage or as dependents. Their social status varied accordingly, reflecting a spectrum rather than a single class. Material culture highlights the complex position of artisans. High-quality craftsmanship elevated their economic value, but inscriptions rarely identify artisans by name, suggesting limited social recognition. Nevertheless, their work was essential to elite self-presentation and religious practice. A second interpretive insight follows. Artisan labor enabled social hierarchy by materializing elite identity, even as artisans themselves remained socially constrained. At the base of the social structure were enslaved individuals, whose presence is inferred from both literary sources and indirect archaeological evidence. Roman authors refer to Etruscan slavery in domestic, agricultural, and industrial contexts. Enslaved people likely included war captives and individuals born into servitude. They performed labor-intensive tasks and lacked legal personhood, though specific details of their lives remain difficult to reconstruct due to limited direct evidence. Inscriptions occasionally reference individuals with non-Etruscan names or ambiguous status, which some scholars interpret as indicators of servitude or foreign origin. Additionally, the scale of agricultural estates and workshops suggests reliance on coerced labor. This supports the conclusion that slavery was an integral component of the Etruscan economy, underpinning elite wealth and urban productivity. Citizenship in Etruscan cities did not correspond to modern notions of equality or rights. Instead, it denoted belonging to the civic body and participation in its obligations and rituals. Religious festivals, military service, and communal labor reinforced collective identity, while simultaneously highlighting status distinctions. Public spaces, such as sanctuaries and cemeteries, served as arenas where social hierarchy was made visible through spatial organization and material display. A third interpretive insight arises from this structure. Social stratification was reinforced through visibility rather than legal codification. Without extensive written law codes, hierarchy was maintained through custom, ritual, and public representation. Tombs, monuments, and religious offerings communicated social rank more effectively than formal statutes. By the late 6th century BCE, Etruscan social divisions had become deeply embedded within urban life. Aristocrats controlled political and religious authority, commoners sustained the economy and military, artisans enabled production and cultural expression, and enslaved populations provided essential labor. This system supported stability and cultural achievement, but it also constrained social mobility and concentrated power within a narrow elite. These divisions shaped cultural expression, influencing art, ritual practice, and the public representation of identity within Etruscan society. Law and religion were inseparable in Etruscan governance, shaping political decision-making through ritual, divination, and inherited custom rather than codified statutes. Unlike later Roman systems grounded in written law codes, Etruscan governance operated through a framework of customary law, religious authority, and ritualized procedure. Political decisions were embedded within a sacred worldview in which divine will was believed to actively govern human affairs. Archaeological evidence, inscriptions, and later Roman testimony indicate that legal norms were transmitted through tradition, priestly interpretation, and communal precedent, rather than fixed legal texts. At the center of this system stood the religious specialists, particularly augurs and haruspices, whose interpretations guided civic action. Records indicate that Etruscan magistrates routinely consulted divination before undertaking political, military, or infrastructural decisions. The discipline known as the Etrusca disciplina, later described by Roman authors such as Cicero and Seneca, outlined ritual procedures for interpreting lightning, celestial phenomena, and animal entrails. These practices were not peripheral. They constituted a governing mechanism through which authority was legitimized. Governance, therefore, functioned as a ritual process. Magistrates did not simply rule by decree but acted as intermediaries between the city and the divine realm. Archaeologists uncovered sanctuaries positioned near civic centers, indicating that political and religious spaces were closely integrated. This spatial arrangement reinforces the interpretation that law was enacted through sacred observance rather than administrative bureaucracy. Legal authority rested with elite magistrates and councils, whose legitimacy depended on correct ritual conduct. Tomb inscriptions and dedicatory texts suggest that offices were held temporarily and rotated among aristocratic families. While the precise structure varied by city, governance typically involved a leading magistrate, sometimes identified by Roman authors as a lucumo, supported by advisory bodies composed of elite elders. These councils adjudicated disputes, oversaw land allocation, and coordinated communal labor. One interpretive insight emerges clearly. Etruscan law prioritized harmony with the divine over abstract justice. Decisions were evaluated not by universal principles but by whether they aligned with perceived cosmic order. This explains the absence of surviving legal codes. Authority was situational, interpreted through ritual expertise rather than textual consistency. Custom, mos, functioned as the primary legal foundation. Social expectations regarding inheritance, marriage, burial rights, and property ownership were maintained through precedent. Burial evidence demonstrates consistent patterns in family tomb usage across generations, indicating recognized inheritance norms. Similarly, land division inferred from settlement layouts suggests long-standing agreements respected over time. These customs were enforced socially rather than through formal punishment systems. Punitive practices remain poorly documented, but Roman sources imply that penalties emphasized exclusion, confiscation, or ritual sanction rather than incarceration. Given the communal nature of Etruscan cities, loss of status or religious standing would have constituted a severe consequence. In this context, governance relied on consensus and elite mediation more than coercive enforcement. Augury played a decisive role in civic timing and legality. Public assemblies, military campaigns, and construction projects were preceded by divinatory rituals. Archaeological finds of inscribed bronze livers, most notably the Piacenza liver, provide material evidence of standardized divinatory frameworks. These objects mapped divine domains and guided priests in interpreting omens. Their existence indicates a formalized intellectual system supporting governance. A second interpretive insight follows. Divination functioned as a regulatory system, limiting arbitrary power. Even elite magistrates were constrained by ritual outcomes, which could delay or invalidate political action. This mechanism introduced a form of accountability, not to citizens, but to the divine order understood by the community. Civic rituals reinforced legal norms by making governance visible. Processions, sacrifices, and public dedications marked transitions in authority and reaffirmed communal bonds. Inscriptions on votive offerings often named magistrates and gods together, symbolically linking political authority to divine approval. These acts served both religious and legal purposes, reaffirming legitimacy through public observance. Roman authors later noted that many early Roman legal religious practices, augury, temple inauguration, boundary rights, were derived from Etruscan models. This transmission suggests that Etruscan governance was not informal or primitive but highly structured within its own conceptual framework. Its logic differed from later legalism, but it achieved stability through ritual repetition and elite continuity. A third interpretive insight emerges here. Etruscan governance demonstrates that complex legal systems can exist without codification, relying instead on shared belief, ritual expertise, and social memory. This system proved resilient for centuries, sustaining urban societies across Etruria. By the late Archaic period, Etruscan law and governance operated as an integrated sacred political system. Authority flowed from elite lineage, was enacted through councils and magistracies, and was validated by ritual conformity. Custom governed daily life while divination shaped major decisions. Together, these practices created a stable, if rigid, civic order that defined Etruscan political culture. This worldview extended into religion and belief, where divine order structured not only governance but the Etruscan understanding of the cosmos itself. The Etruscans believed the gods governed all events, from the founding of cities to the outcome of battles and the fate of individuals. Etruscan religion was structured around a highly ordered pantheon and a cosmology in which divine will actively shaped the human world. Unlike later philosophical systems that separated natural causation from the supernatural, Etruscan belief assumed constant interaction between gods and mortals. Every political decision, environmental phenomenon, and personal fortune was understood as an expression of divine intention, accessible through ritual interpretation. At the apex of the pantheon stood Tinia, the supreme sky god and ultimate authority over the cosmos. Tinia controlled lightning, celestial order, and the boundaries between divine and human realms. Archaeological evidence from temple dedications and inscriptions identifies Tinia as the chief recipient of state-sponsored worship. He was often paired with Uni, a powerful goddess associated with marriage, fertility, and civic protection, and Minerva, a deity of wisdom, warfare, and technical skill. Together, This triad formed the central axis of Etruscan divine authority, later influencing the Roman Capitoline triad of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. The prominence of this triad reflects an organized theological structure rather than a loose collection of cults. Sanctuaries dedicated to Tinia, Uni, and Minerva have been excavated at sites such as Veii, Portnacho Temple, where architectural remains and votive offerings demonstrate sustained communal investment. These temples were not isolated religious spaces. They functioned as civic centers where political authority and divine favor were symbolically aligned. Beyond the principal gods, the Etruscan pantheon included a wide array of secondary deities, spirits, and chthonic figures governing specific domains. Deities such as Turon, love and vitality, Aplu, health and prophecy, and Fufluns, vegetation and renewal, oversaw aspects of daily life and natural cycles. Underworld gods, including Ida and Phursephne, presided over death and the afterlife, reflecting a cosmology that extended divine order beyond earthly existence. This layered pantheon reveals a key interpretive insight. Etruscan religion emphasized regulation over mythology. While myths existed, the primary concern was not narrative storytelling but the maintenance of balance between divine forces. Each god occupied a defined role within a structured cosmic hierarchy, reinforcing the belief that disorder resulted from ritual failure rather than moral transgression. Etruscan cosmology divided the universe into clearly demarcated zones, both spatially and temporally. Ancient sources report that the Etruscans believed the lifespan of a city and its people was predetermined by divine decree. This concept, known through Roman accounts of Etruscan doctrine, framed history as a sequence of divinely allotted ages rather than open-ended progress. Archaeological patterns of ritual renewal and temple rebuilding suggest that communities acted with awareness of cyclical divine time. The heavens themselves were mapped according to divine sectors. Evidence for this comes from ritual objects such as the Piacenza liver, a bronze model of a sheep's liver inscribed with the names of gods assigned to specific regions. Although primarily used for divination, it also reflects a broader cosmological model in which the sky, earth, and underworld were organized into corresponding zones of divine authority. This structured worldview reinforced the idea that every phenomenon had an assigned divine cause. A second interpretive insight emerges here. Etruscan theology transformed uncertainty into order. By assigning divine responsibility to all events, the Etruscans created an intellectual framework that made the world interpretable, even when outcomes were unfavorable. Misfortune indicated misinterpretation or ritual error, not randomness. Religious belief was inseparable from civic identity. City-states were understood to exist under the protection and surveillance of specific gods. Foundation rituals, boundary demarcations, and temple inaugurations established a sacred contract between the city and its divine patrons. Inscriptions on votive offerings frequently name both the deity and the dedicating magistrate, demonstrating how religious observance validated political authority. Artistic representations further reinforce this worldview. Wall paintings in tombs, relief sculptures, and bronze mirrors depict gods interacting directly with humans, often in advisory or supervisory roles. These images do not portray distant deities but active participants in human affairs. Their presence in funerary contexts also indicates that divine order extended beyond life into the afterlife, governing fate after death. A third interpretive insight follows. Etruscan religion functioned as a totalizing system, integrating politics, law, cosmology, and personal destiny. There was no conceptual separation between sacred and secular realms. This integration allowed religious specialists to wield significant influence while providing communal coherence across generations. Although heavily ritualized, Etruscan religion was not static. Contact with Greek colonies introduced new iconography and divine associations, which the Etruscans adapted without abandoning their core cosmology. Greek gods were assimilated into existing structures rather than replacing native deities, preserving theological continuity while allowing cultural exchange. By the 6th century BCE, the Etruscan pantheon and divine order had reached a mature and standardized form across much of Etruria. Central gods governed cosmic authority, secondary deities regulated daily life, and underworld figures structured beliefs about death. Together, these elements formed a coherent system that shaped governance, law, and social behavior. Interpreting divine will become a civic function, requiring specialized knowledge and ritual precision to translate cosmic order into human action. Etruscan religion sought certainty in an uncertain world by systematizing the interpretation of divine signs. Central to Etruscan religious practice was the belief that the gods continuously communicated their will through observable phenomena. Divination was not a marginal or mystical pursuit. It was a formalized body of sacred knowledge that structured political decisions, military actions, and communal life. Through ritual expertise, the Etruscans believed uncertainty could be reduced and human actions aligned with divine order. The most distinctive divinatory practice was haruspicy, the examination of the entrails of sacrificed animals, particularly the liver. Archaeologists uncovered numerous ritual implements associated with this practice, most notably the Piacenza liver, a bronze model dated to the late 2nd or early 1st century BCE. Inscribed with the names of deities across segmented zones, the object illustrates a standardized interpretive system. Each section corresponded to a divine domain, allowing priests to read abnormalities in the organ as specific messages from particular gods. Although the Piacenza liver is a late artifact, Roman literary sources indicate that its underlying system derived from much earlier Etruscan traditions. Cicero, in De Divination, explicitly credits the Etruscans with codifying haruspical knowledge into formal doctrines. These doctrines were preserved in what Roman authors later called the Etrusca Disciplina, a collective term for sacred texts outlining divinatory rules and ritual procedures. Haruspices were trained specialists, often drawn from elite families and educated through long apprenticeships. Their authority rested not on personal charisma but on mastery of inherited knowledge. This introduces a key interpretive insight. Etruscan divination functioned as a learned discipline rather than ecstatic prophecy. The priest did not predict the future spontaneously but interpreted signs according to established frameworks. In addition to haruspicy, augury played a critical role in civic life. Augurs interpreted the will of the gods through natural signs such as the flight patterns of birds, thunder, lightning, and other atmospheric phenomena. Archaeological evidence, combined with Roman testimony, suggests that Etruscan augury was particularly influential in determining the timing and legitimacy of public actions. Construction projects, military campaigns, and political assemblies required favorable signs before proceeding. Lightning held special significance. Tinia, the supreme god, was believed to communicate directly through lightning bolts, which were classified according to direction, intensity, and point of impact. Ritual texts described complex procedures for interpreting these signs, and areas struck by lightning were often ritually marked or enclosed. Excavations at Etruscan sites have revealed sacred boundary markers consistent with such practices, supporting the literary record. A second interpretive insight emerges here. Divination imposed procedural limits on political power. Even kings and magistrates were constrained by ritual outcomes. An unfavorable omen could delay or nullify decisions, embedding divine consultation into governance. This system did not democratize power, but it regulated elite authority through shared religious norms. The Etrusca Disciplina itself was traditionally divided into three main branches, as described by Roman authors: the libri haruspicini, entrails, libri fulgurales, lightning, and libri rituals, ritual law and civic order. Although none of these texts survive directly, their content can be partially reconstructed through Roman adaptations and references. The libri rituals, in particular, address city founding, boundary demarcation, and the proper organization of civic space, linking divination to urban planning. Sacred knowledge was considered ancient and revealed rather than invented. Etruscan tradition held that this wisdom was granted by divine figures such as Tages, a childlike prophet said to have emerged from the earth, and Vigoya, a prophetic nymph associated with boundary laws. While these figures appear mythic, They symbolized the belief that religious law was immutable and divinely sanctioned. This belief reinforced the authority of priestly interpretation across generations. Material evidence supports the widespread integration of divination into daily life. Small votive offerings inscribed with requests or thanks indicate that individuals sought divine guidance for personal matters as well as civic concerns. These objects, recovered from sanctuaries throughout Etruria, demonstrate that sacred interpretation extended beyond elite decision-making into broader social practice. A third interpretive insight follows. Divination served as a shared cognitive framework, allowing communities to interpret misfortune, success, and change within a coherent system. Natural disasters, military defeat, or crop failure were not random but meaningful events requiring corrective ritual action. This worldview reduced unpredictability by embedding it within structured explanation. Roman adoption of Etruscan divinatory practices further underscores their sophistication. Roman magistrates consulted Etruscan haruspices well into the Republican and imperial periods, particularly during crises. Senate records referenced in later histories indicate that Etruscan specialists were summoned to interpret prodigies threatening state stability. This long-term reliance suggests that Etruscan sacred knowledge was regarded as authoritative even outside its original cultural context. By the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, divination had become institutionalized within Etruscan cities. Priests maintained ritual calendars, oversaw sacrifices, and advised magistrates on proper conduct. Sacred knowledge was preserved through oral transmission and restricted access, ensuring continuity but also limiting innovation. This conservatism reinforced social hierarchy while maintaining religious consistency. By the end of the Archaic period, divination, augury, and sacred texts formed an integrated system through which the Etruscans understood and managed their world. Signs were read, rituals enacted, and decisions validated through divine consultation. This system provided intellectual order and civic stability within an unpredictable environment. These beliefs shaped daily and funerary life, influencing how the Etruscans structured ritual practice, commemorated the dead, and understood existence beyond death. Etruscan tombs reveal more than their cities, preserving the most detailed evidence for how this society understood death, identity, and continuity. Etruscan funerary culture provides the richest surviving record of religious belief and social structure, largely because tombs were constructed to endure while settlements were not. From the 8th century BCE onward, burial practices across Etruria reflect a consistent conviction that death marked a transition rather than an end. Archaeological evidence from cemeteries at Tarquinia, Cerveteri, Veii, and Chiusi demonstrates that the afterlife was imagined as an extension of earthly existence, governed by divine order and shaped by social status. Early Villanovan cremation practices gradually gave way to inhumation during the Orientalizing and Archaic periods. This shift coincided with the construction of monumental tombs, often carved into rock or built as tumuli. These structures were designed as permanent family spaces, reused across generations. The internal layout of many tombs imitates domestic architecture, with carved beams, doorways, and furniture. This architectural continuity suggests that the deceased were believed to inhabit a familiar environment after death. Wall paintings offer direct insight into Etruscan conceptions of the afterlife. Tombs such as the Tomb of the Leopards, Tomb of the Augurs, and Tomb of the Blue Demons depict banquets, athletic contests, music, and ritual scenes. These images do not portray mourning or judgment but emphasize continuity, social interaction, and ritual order. Archaeologists uncovered pigments and iconographic conventions indicating sustained artistic programs rather than spontaneous decoration. One interpretive insight is evident here. Etruscan funerary art prioritized social identity over moral evaluation. Unlike later Roman or Christian traditions emphasizing judgment, Etruscan imagery presents the afterlife as structured but not punitive. The deceased retained status, gender roles, and familial associations, reinforcing the belief that social hierarchy persisted beyond death. Sarcophagi further reinforce this continuity. Stone and terracotta sarcophagi often feature reclining figures on the lids, posed as if attending a banquet. Both men and women are represented, sometimes together, suggesting a social visibility for women that contrasts with contemporary Greek norms. Inscriptions on sarcophagi record personal names and lineage, emphasizing family identity rather than individual achievement. Material goods placed within tombs also reflect beliefs about posthumous existence. Weapons, jewelry, tools, and imported luxury items have been recovered from elite burials. These objects were not symbolic alone. They were functional representations of the roles the deceased was expected to maintain. The inclusion of Greek pottery and Near Eastern items further demonstrates that status in life was extended into death. Chthonic deities played a growing role in later funerary iconography. Figures such as Charun, depicted with a hammer, and Vanth, a winged female guide, appear in 4th and 3rd century BCE tomb paintings. These beings are not judges but escorts, guiding the dead into the afterlife. Their presence indicates a more elaborated conception of the journey after death, shaped by evolving religious ideas. A second interpretive insight emerges from this development. Etruscan afterlife beliefs became increasingly structured without becoming moralized. The appearance of underworld figures reflects concern with proper transition rather than ethical judgment. Death required guidance, not evaluation. Burial location and tomb scale reinforced social stratification. Elite families occupied prominent necropolis with monumental architecture, while common burials were simpler and less durable. Yet even modest graves often include ritual goods, indicating that participation in funerary religion extended across social classes. This suggests that belief in an ordered afterlife was widely shared, even if its expression varied by status. Funerary rituals themselves were communal and highly structured. Literary sources and iconography indicate the presence of games, feasting, and processions associated with burial ceremonies. These events reinforced social bonds among the living while honoring the dead. The ritualized nature of these practices aligns with broader Etruscan emphasis on correct procedure and divine order. Inscriptions provide further evidence of religious continuity. Funerary texts often include formulaic language invoking protection or remembrance rather than individual biography. This supports the conclusion that identity was defined relationally, through family and city, rather than through personal narrative. Roman authors later remarked on the Etruscans' preoccupation with death, but archaeological evidence suggests a systematic engagement rather than obsession. The scale and investment in tomb construction reflect a worldview in which proper burial ensured cosmic and social stability. Neglecting funerary obligations risked disrupting the balance between the living, the dead, and the gods. A third interpretive insight follows. Funerary culture functioned as a stabilizing institution, reinforcing hierarchy, religious belief, and collective memory across generations. Tombs acted as anchors of identity, preserving lineage and tradition even as political power shifted. By the late classical period, Etruscan funerary practices had reached a high degree of formalization. Architectural tombs, painted interiors, sculpted sarcophagi, and standardized iconography combined to express a coherent vision of life after death. This vision emphasized continuity, order, and divine supervision rather than rupture or judgment. By the end of the 4th century BCE, although Etruscan political independence was declining, funerary traditions persisted with remarkable consistency. The tombs remained active spaces of memory and ritual, preserving religious concepts that outlasted Etruscan autonomy. Religion also shaped economic and artistic production, influencing how materials, labor, and symbolic forms were organized within Etruscan society. Etruscan wealth began in the soil, rooted in a landscape carefully managed to sustain surplus, hierarchy, and urban growth. Agriculture formed the economic foundation of Etruscan society, supporting population concentration, elite authority, and long-distance trade. The core regions of Etruria, stretching across modern Tuscany, northern Lazio, and parts of Umbria, offered fertile plains, rolling hills, and a climate well suited to mixed farming. Archaeological surveys and paleoenvironmental studies indicate sustained agricultural exploitation from the early Iron Age onward, with increasing intensification during the Orientalizing and Archaic periods. Primary crops included cereals such as wheat and barley, supplemented by legumes, fruits, and vegetables. Evidence from carbonized seeds recovered at settlement sites confirms widespread grain cultivation. Over time, viticulture and olive production became increasingly prominent, as indicated by pruning tools, presses, and amphory fragments. These crops not only supported local consumption but also generated surplus suitable for trade. Land control was central to agricultural productivity. Elite families owned large estates, often worked by dependent laborers and enslaved individuals. Tomb inscriptions and settlement patterns suggest hereditary landholding, reinforcing social stratification. The concentration of land in aristocratic hands allowed coordinated production and storage, ensuring reliable surplus generation. This system reflects an interpretive insight. Economic power in Etruria was inseparable from control of land, anchoring political authority in agricultural dominance. Resource management extended beyond crop cultivation. Archaeologists uncovered extensive evidence of irrigation and drainage systems, particularly in lowland areas prone to flooding. Channels, ditches, and reclaimed marshlands demonstrate technical expertise in water control. Roman sources later credited the Etruscans with pioneering hydraulic engineering, including land reclamation projects later adopted by Roman administrators. These interventions expanded arable land and stabilized yields, supporting urban populations. Forestry also played a significant role. Timber from Etrurian forests was used for construction, shipbuilding, and fuel. Pollen analysis indicates managed woodland rather than uncontrolled exploitation, suggesting an understanding of sustainable resource use. This management balanced immediate economic needs with long-term productivity, reinforcing agricultural resilience. Animal husbandry complemented crop farming. Cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs were raised for meat, labor, wool, and secondary products. Zooarchaeological remains indicate selective breeding and organized herding practices. Wool production, in particular, supported textile manufacture, a key artisanal sector closely tied to agricultural output. Storage and redistribution mechanisms reveal the structured nature of agricultural economy. Large storage vessels and granaries have been identified at elite residences and communal sites. These facilities allowed surplus accumulation, buffering against crop failure and enabling redistribution during festivals, rituals, or shortages. This system reinforced elite legitimacy by linking authority to economic stability. A second interpretive insight emerges here. Agricultural surplus functioned as a social tool, not merely an economic one. By controlling storage and distribution, elites reinforced dependency relationships and civic cohesion. Surplus underwrote public rituals, construction projects, and military campaigns, integrating agriculture into every aspect of Etruscan life. Agricultural production was also shaped by religious practice. Ritual calendars regulated planting and harvesting, aligning agricultural cycles with divine observance. Votive offerings of miniature tools and agricultural produce found in sanctuaries suggest that farmers sought divine favor for successful yields. This integration of religion and agriculture ensured that land management followed both practical and ritual considerations. Archaeological field surveys demonstrate gradual expansion of cultivated land over time. Hill slopes were terraced, and marginal lands were brought into production as populations grew. This expansion reflects adaptive strategies rather than reckless exploitation, suggesting careful planning and communal coordination. Despite its strengths, the agricultural system had vulnerabilities. Dependence on elite-controlled estates limited flexibility, and environmental pressures such as soil exhaustion or climate variability posed risks. These factors would later intersect with political instability and external competition. By the 6th century BCE, Etruscan agriculture had achieved a high level of organization and productivity. Integrated farming systems, effective land management, and surplus generation sustained urban growth and social hierarchy. The soil provided not only food but the material basis for wealth, authority, and cultural development. Surplus enabled trade and specialization, allowing Etruscan cities to engage in long-distance exchange and develop advanced craft production. Metal defined Etruscan power, transforming natural resources into economic leverage and political influence. Metallurgy stood at the core of Etruscan industrial output and external influence. From the early Iron Age onward, Etruria became one of the most significant metal-producing regions in the central Mediterranean. Archaeological and geological evidence identifies abundant deposits of iron, copper, tin, and lead, with iron playing the most decisive role in economic expansion. Control over these resources underpinned military capability, craft specialization, and long-distance trade. The island of Elba was central to this system. Rich iron ore deposits made Elba a primary extraction zone from at least the 8th century BCE. Archaeologists uncovered slag heaps, furnace remains, and mining tools attesting to large-scale ore processing. Classical authors later remarked on the island's productivity, and isotopic analysis of iron artifacts recovered across Etruria confirms Elban origin. This material linkage demonstrates an organized supply chain connecting extraction sites to mainland workshops. Iron production followed a multi-stage process. Ore was extracted and partially smelted near mining sites, then transported to coastal or inland centers for refinement. Workshops identified at Populonia, Vecchilonia, and Vulci reveal standardized production methods. Furnaces, anvils, molds, and waste deposits indicate continuous, high-volume output rather than episodic craft activity. This industrial scale introduces a key interpretive insight. Etruscan metallurgy functioned as an early industrial economy, exceeding subsistence craft and approaching systematic mass production. The concentration of workshops and consistency of output suggest coordinated labor, resource planning, and elite oversight. Beyond iron, Etruscan metalworkers produced bronze objects of exceptional quality. Bronze vessels, weapons, mirrors, and ritual implements demonstrate advanced alloy control and decorative techniques. The widespread distribution of Etruscan bronze mirrors, often engraved with mythological scenes, indicates both technical skill and export orientation. Inscriptions on some mirrors provide linguistic evidence of production centers and reinforce their cultural significance. Metal goods served both practical and symbolic functions. Weapons and tools supported agriculture and warfare, while luxury items reinforced elite identity and ritual practice. Tomb assemblages consistently include metal artifacts, linking metallurgy directly to social hierarchy and funerary culture. Workshop organization varied by region. Some were attached to elite households, while others operated in designated industrial quarters. Archaeological surveys reveal zoning within urban centers, separating residential, sacred, and industrial spaces. This spatial organization reflects civic planning and regulatory oversight, aligning production with urban infrastructure. Labor in metallurgical production likely included free artisans, dependents, and enslaved individuals. Although direct evidence is limited, the scale of production implies a diverse workforce. Control of labor reinforced elite dominance, as access to metal goods translated into military strength and economic exchange. A second interpretive insight emerges here. Metallurgy linked economic power to coercive capacity. Iron weapons and armor enhanced military effectiveness, while metal tools increased agricultural productivity. This dual impact amplified Etruscan influence both internally and externally. Environmental impact is evident in charcoal production and deforestation around industrial centers. Pollen studies indicate localized woodland reduction near smelting sites. However, managed forestry practices mitigated long-term damage, suggesting awareness of resource limits. Etruscan metal goods reached distant markets. Archaeological finds of Etruscan weapons, tools, and luxury items appear in southern France, the Adriatic, and the eastern Mediterranean. These distributions confirm that metallurgy supported extensive trade networks, positioning Etruria as a supplier of high-demand materials. Roman adoption of Etruscan metallurgical techniques further underscores their sophistication. Early Roman weaponry and tools show continuity with Etruscan forms, indicating knowledge transfer alongside political expansion. By the 6th century BCE, metallurgy had become institutionalized within Etruscan economies. Extraction, processing, and distribution formed an integrated system linking mines, workshops, and ports. This system generated wealth, supported urban growth, and projected power beyond Etruria. A third interpretive insight follows. Industrial output transformed Etruscan cities into economic hubs, making them indispensable nodes within Mediterranean exchange networks. By the late Archaic period, however, competition intensified as Greek and later Roman producers entered metal markets. Although Etruscan output remained significant, external pressures would gradually erode their industrial dominance. These goods moved across the Mediterranean, integrating Etruria into long-distance trade networks that shaped its economic and cultural trajectory. The Etruscans were deeply connected to the wider world, linking their cities to the vibrant trade networks of the central Mediterranean. Etruscan prosperity depended not only on agriculture and metallurgy but also on extensive trade relations. From the 8th century BCE onward, Etruscan ports, coastal settlements, and inland cities participated in exchange networks connecting Greece, Phoenicia, Carthage, and other Mediterranean polities. Archaeological evidence, including imported pottery, inscriptions, and luxury goods, confirms the sophistication and reach of these commercial interactions. Greek influence was particularly pronounced. Etruscans imported Attic and Corinthian pottery, often repurposed for both domestic use and ritual contexts. Vases and amphorae, recovered from tombs at Cerveteri and Tarquinia, reveal stylistic adaptation. Local workshops produced Etruscanized copies of Greek designs. This process reflects selective cultural assimilation, allowing the Etruscans to participate in Mediterranean aesthetics while reinforcing local identity. Phoenician traders connected Etruria to Levantine markets. Evidence of Phoenician origin goods, including ivory, glass, and metal objects, appears in elite tomb assemblages. Coastal settlements such as Populonia and Perge functioned as points of exchange, facilitating both import and export. The discovery of the Perge tablets, inscribed in both Etruscan and Phoenician scripts, demonstrates formalized communication and contractual arrangements, indicating literacy and diplomacy in trade networks. Carthaginian contacts, while less frequent, were significant for metal and luxury goods. Maritime routes along the Tyrrhenian coast enabled access to African and Western Mediterranean markets, expanding the diversity of imported commodities. These connections also contributed to the diffusion of technological knowledge, including shipbuilding techniques and metallurgical practices. Internal trade networks complemented these international routes. Etruscan cities exchanged surplus agricultural products, metal goods, textiles, and ceramics along river valleys and overland roads. Archaeological surveys indicate well-developed secondary markets in inland centers, suggesting a sophisticated logistical infrastructure. This internal cohesion amplified external trade benefits, creating a vertically integrated economic system. A key interpretive insight is evident. Etruscan trade was both economic and diplomatic, embedding cities within broader Mediterranean political networks. Trade goods were not solely utilitarian but served as symbols of status, facilitating elite competition and social consolidation. Imported objects and stylistic motifs reinforced civic prestige and religious observance, linking commerce to cultural expression. Ports and harbors reveal the practical organization of trade. Excavations at Populonia uncovered warehouses, slipways, and anchorage areas, indicating the scale of maritime activity. Shipwrecks along the Tyrrhenian coast provide additional evidence of Etruscan participation in trans-Mediterranean exchange, with cargoes including metal ingots, ceramics, and luxury items. These findings confirm the active mobility of goods and people, underlining Etruria's economic integration. Economic specialization also emerged from trade. Artisans and workshops tailored production to meet the demands of external markets. For example, Etruscan bronzes and ceramics exported to Greece display stylistic modifications catering to foreign tastes. Similarly, imported luxury goods were often reworked or adapted for local use, indicating a dynamic interplay between consumption and production. A second interpretive insight follows. Etruscan trade networks facilitated technological and cultural transfer, allowing the society to absorb innovations without losing distinct identity. Greek artistic motifs, Phoenician inscriptions, and Carthaginian techniques were integrated selectively, enhancing domestic production and enriching cultural life. Trade generated considerable wealth, reinforcing social hierarchy and supporting political structures. Elite families controlled the flow of imported goods and oversaw commercial ventures, consolidating power while funding civic projects, religious dedications, and monumental construction. Tomb evidence shows imported luxury items concentrated among aristocratic graves, linking commercial success to social visibility. Maritime trade also shaped military considerations. Control of harbors and coastal settlements was essential to safeguard commercial routes and ensure access to strategic resources. This economic military nexus positioned Etruscan cities as both trading hubs and regional powers, capable of projecting influence through naval and terrestrial means. By the 5th century BCE, Etruria's integration into Mediterranean commerce had reached its peak. Greek, Phoenician, and Carthaginian contacts were established and sustained. Internal trade networks functioned efficiently, and elite families leveraged wealth to reinforce civic and religious authority. These networks not only generated material prosperity but also enabled cultural exchange and technological diffusion. A third interpretive insight emerges here. Trade served as a stabilizing and legitimizing force, underpinning social, political, and religious systems. Economic success reinforced elite dominance, funded urban expansion, and facilitated participation in broader Mediterranean culture. By the late classical period, however, external competition and the rise of Rome began to challenge Etruscan commercial preeminence. Greek colonies, Carthaginian influence, and expanding Roman control gradually shifted trade dynamics. Nevertheless, the infrastructure, techniques, and cultural adaptations established during earlier centuries continued to influence regional economies. Trade wealth supported military expansion, allowing Etruscan cities to fortify territory, field armies, and project power across central Italy. Etruscan armies mirrored their society, reflecting social hierarchy, civic organization, and elite control over resources. Military organization in Etruria was closely tied to the structure of the city-state. Unlike later professional standing armies, Etruscan forces were largely citizen militias, composed of male landowners obligated to provide service during conflicts. Tomb inscriptions and artistic depictions reveal that military participation was both a duty and a marker of social status, with elite families supplying better-equipped contingents and assuming command roles. By the 7th century BCE, Etruscan warfare had begun to incorporate elements borrowed from Greek military practice, particularly the hoplite phalanx. Archaeological evidence includes bronze cuirasses, greaves, and helmets consistent with Hellenic designs. Depictions on mirrors, votive reliefs, and tomb paintings illustrate infantry advancing in formation with spears and shields, indicating adoption of organized, disciplined tactics. These innovations reflect selective integration of foreign military models to strengthen civic defense. Armies were supplemented by cavalry units and light infantry, providing flexibility in both siege and field engagements. Horse burials and figurines suggest that cavalry was the preserve of the aristocracy, reinforcing social stratification within military structures. Elite commanders, often drawn from the same lineages controlling political and religious authority, directed these combined forces, linking martial and civic leadership. Weapon production was closely tied to metallurgical expertise. Iron swords, spears, and defensive equipment were manufactured in Etruscan workshops, as confirmed by slag deposits and molds discovered at Populonia and Vetulonia. This local production allowed city-states to equip militias independently and maintain readiness without relying solely on imports. A key interpretive insight emerges. Military capability reinforced civic cohesion and elite authority. Service in arms was both an obligation and a means to display loyalty, while effective command rested on the same families that controlled law, religion, and economy. Military organization thus mirrored social and political hierarchies rather than existing as a separate institution. Etruscan cities sometimes coordinated militarily through the League of 12 Cities, although evidence suggests that joint campaigns were rare and limited to defensive or symbolic operations. Nonetheless, alliances provided opportunities for pooling resources and experience, enhancing collective security against external threats such as Greek colonies or Italic neighbors. Tactics emphasized flexibility and adaptability. While hoplite-style phalanxes were deployed in open-field engagements, Etruscan forces also engaged in skirmishes, raids, and fortified city defense. Archaeological surveys reveal hilltop fortifications, trench systems, and gate complexes, underscoring the importance of strategic terrain in both offensive and defensive operations. Logistical considerations were significant. Grain, metal, and equipment production were coordinated to sustain campaigns. Surplus from agriculture and metallurgy directly enabled prolonged military activity, linking economic strength to battlefield capacity. This connection highlights the systemic integration of society, economy, and warfare. A second interpretive insight follows. Etruscan military development was adaptive rather than revolutionary. By combining indigenous practices with selective foreign innovations, city-states maximized local advantages while maintaining social cohesion. This approach demonstrates strategic pragmatism rather than imitation for its own sake. Leadership was further legitimized through ritual. Victories, army mustering, and campaigns were often accompanied by sacrifices and divinatory consultation. Augurs and haruspices played a practical role in determining the timing of operations, ensuring that military actions aligned with perceived divine favor. Such practices reinforced the inseparability of religion, governance, and military function in Etruscan society. Equipment standards and uniformity varied by city and campaign. Archaeologists note regional differences in shield shape, helmet style, and armor type, reflecting local workshop traditions. Nonetheless, elite troops consistently possessed superior gear, emphasizing status differentiation within the ranks. By the 6th century BCE, Etruscan military forces had become capable of defending city-states, projecting power into neighboring territories, and engaging with emerging regional powers such as Rome, Latium, and Greek colonies along the coast. These developments established the foundation for subsequent territorial expansion and intercity rivalry. A third interpretive insight is evident. Military organization not only ensured defense but underwrote political and economic expansion. Cohesive, well-equipped militias allowed Etruscan elites to pursue territorial growth while maintaining internal social order. By the end of the Archaic period, the Etruscan approach to warfare reflected a systemic alignment of society, economy, and religion, ensuring that armed forces operated as an extension of civic and elite structures. Military success fueled territorial growth, enabling Etruscan cities to consolidate influence over surrounding settlements and resources. By the 6th century BCE, Etruscan power peaked, extending influence across Latium and Campania and reshaping the political landscape of central Italy. Etruscan expansion in the Archaic period reflected the combination of military capability, economic resources, and urban coordination. City-states such as Veii, Tarquinia, and Cerveteri leveraged their citizen militias, wealth from trade and metallurgy, and centralized governance to project authority beyond traditional territorial cores. Archaeological and textual evidence indicates a pattern of gradual, organized expansion rather than abrupt conquest. In Latium, Etruscan influence extended along the Tiber River valley and surrounding plains. Settlements such as Fidene, Capena, and Ficana show Etruscan architectural styles, pottery, and burial practices, suggesting political or cultural dominance. Excavations reveal fortifications and administrative structures consistent with direct control or client-state arrangements. Roman literary sources, including Livy and Dionysius of Halicarnassus, describe Etruscan involvement in regional disputes, highlighting both military campaigns and diplomatic influence. To the south, Campania became a zone of economic and strategic interest. Coastal cities such as Cumae, Neapolis, and Capua engaged with Etruscan traders and settlers, facilitating access to maritime trade and fertile agricultural lands. Tomb inscriptions and material culture in the region indicate assimilation of Etruscan administrative and ritual practices. Populonia, located on the Tyrrhenian coast, acted as a hub linking northern Etruria with southern markets, supporting both economic and territorial expansion. A key interpretive insight emerges. Etruscan expansion combined military conquest with cultural integration. Rather than solely imposing control through force, Etruscan city-states fostered political alliances, client settlements, and cultural influence. Material culture, temples, fortifications, and imported goods served as instruments of authority alongside armed intervention. Territorial expansion also depended on infrastructure and resource management. Newly acquired lands were incorporated into networks of roads, storage facilities, and fortified outposts. Archaeological surveys reveal standardization of building techniques and urban planning, suggesting administrative oversight by central authorities. Surplus production, both agricultural and metallurgical, supported garrisoning troops and provisioning dependent communities, linking economic and military strategy. The Etruscans faced both opportunities and constraints in their expansion. Geographic advantages such as defensible hills and navigable rivers facilitated control, but natural barriers, mountains, marshes, and river crossings, limited the speed and scope of campaigns. Strategic settlement placement reflects careful consideration of terrain, trade access, and potential resistance from Italic neighbors. A second interpretive insight is evident. Etruscan expansion was systemically strategic, integrating geography, economy, and military logistics. Control was exercised where it could be maintained sustainably, rather than pursuing maximalist or purely symbolic conquest. Political control over Latium and Campania also required negotiation with local populations. Etruscan authorities often allowed existing settlements to retain internal autonomy while acknowledging external oversight. Evidence from inscriptions and civic architecture suggests that local elites collaborated with Etruscan administrators, providing manpower, tribute, and compliance in exchange for protection and economic advantage. Trade and cultural dissemination accompanied territorial growth. The spread of Etruscan pottery, ritual practices, and urban planning reinforced identity and loyalty across regions. Ports and inland nodes served as both economic conduits and markers of political influence, integrating newly controlled areas into the broader Etruscan system. A third interpretive insight follows. Etruscan expansion exemplified a hybrid model of control, combining direct military enforcement, economic leverage, and cultural integration. This approach allowed city-states to maintain influence over diverse populations and minimize resistance. By the end of the 6th century BCE, Etruscan authority in central Italy had reached its zenith. Latium and Campania reflected a mixture of Etruscan settlements, allied cities, and client communities, forming a network of influence that extended the political, religious, and economic reach of the core city-states. This expansion brought new rivals, as rising powers, particularly Rome, Greek colonies, and Italic neighbors, challenged Etruscan dominance and set the stage for the competitive conflicts of the classical period. The Tyrrhenian Sea bore their name, reflecting the Etruscans' mastery of maritime power and their influence over central Mediterranean waters. Etruscan city-states developed significant naval capabilities by the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, complementing their terrestrial expansion. Coastal settlements such as Populonia, Pergi, and Gravisca functioned as maritime hubs, linking the interior of Etruria to wider Mediterranean trade networks. Archaeological evidence, including shipwrecks, dock remains, and harbor installations, demonstrates that Etruscan fleets were organized, well-equipped, and capable of both commercial and military operations. Naval organization primarily supported trade protection, resource transport, and regional dominance. The Etruscans relied on swift galleys and lighter vessels designed for coastal patrols, convoy escort, and amphibious troop deployment. Literary sources, such as Herodotus and Dionysius of Halicarnassus, note that Etruscan ships transported metals, timber, and luxury goods, linking their economic and military activities. Control of maritime routes enhanced political leverage over neighboring peoples and facilitated rapid response to threats. Maritime conflict occasionally escalated into open warfare. Classical sources accuse Etruscan sailors of piracy, particularly along the Tyrrhenian coast, although archaeological evidence suggests these actions were often interconnected with trade disputes and territorial competition rather than indiscriminate raiding. Fortified harbors and coastal watchtowers support the interpretation that Etruscan naval power combined defense, projection of authority, and control over maritime resources. A key interpretive insight emerges. Etruscan naval capacity reinforced both economic and political power, allowing city-states to secure trade routes, protect strategic ports, and exert influence across the western Mediterranean. Sea control also supported expansionist ambitions in southern Latium and Campania, facilitating troop transport and logistical coordination. Ship construction was closely linked to metallurgical and woodworking expertise. Excavations of harbor sites reveal tools for hull shaping, plank fastening, and mass production, while recovered anchors, rudder fittings, and bronze fittings reflect advanced technical knowledge. Coordination between inland industrial centers and port facilities ensured that ships were both functional and durable, supporting sustained maritime activity. Naval tactics combined blockade, convoy escort, and limited amphibious assault, with fleets often operating in coordination with land forces. Tomb reliefs and vase paintings depict combined arms engagements, highlighting the integration of maritime and terrestrial strategy. Etruscan naval power also enabled control over key islands and coastal settlements, extending influence into the Tyrrhenian and Ligurian seas. A second interpretive insight is evident. Maritime organization was an extension of city-state governance, with resources, labor, and strategic planning reflecting elite coordination and civic oversight. Authority at sea mirrored terrestrial hierarchies, reinforcing social and political structures. Conflict with emerging powers became increasingly significant. Greek colonies in southern Italy, Carthaginian trading interests, and Italic neighbors challenged Etruscan control of key maritime routes. Epigraphic and literary evidence indicates episodes of negotiation, alliance, and armed engagement, suggesting a complex interplay between commerce and conflict. Control of coastal nodes such as Cumae and Capua remained contested, requiring ongoing vigilance and naval readiness. Despite these pressures, Etruscan maritime infrastructure remained advanced. Harbors were reinforced with stone quays, warehouses, and defensive towers, supporting both long-distance trade and coastal security. Artifacts associated with cargo handling, such as amphorae, ropes, and weights, demonstrate systematic commercial organization alongside military preparedness. A third interpretive insight follows. Naval power underpinned strategic resilience, allowing Etruscan cities to maintain influence even amid regional competition. Control of the sea complemented land-based military campaigns and reinforced the economic foundations of city-states. By the end of the 6th century BCE, Etruscan naval strength was an established component of regional dominance. Fleet deployment, port management, and maritime logistics enabled the cities to secure trade, project authority, and respond to rivals. However, emerging competitors, particularly Rome and Greek colonies, increasingly contested this influence, setting the stage for intensified military and political conflicts. Conflict intensified across Italy as Etruscan city-states confronted rising powers, internal competition, and external pressures that would shape the trajectory of their political and military institutions. Greek resistance altered Etruscan fortunes, demonstrating the limits of their maritime and regional dominance. The Battle of Cumae in 474 BCE marked a pivotal turning point in Etruscan-Greek relations. By the 5th century BCE, Etruscan city-states such as Veii, Tarquinia, and Caere had established extensive influence along the Campanian coast, dominating trade routes and securing political leverage over coastal settlements. However, Greek colonies, particularly Cumae, founded by settlers from Euboea and allied with powerful maritime forces, posed a formidable challenge to this expansion. Archaeological and textual sources indicate that the Etruscans assembled a significant fleet to assert control over the region. Contemporary accounts, most notably from Dionysius of Halicarnassus and later Roman historians, describe a coalition of Etruscan cities engaging in naval combat with Cumae, supported by allied Greek contingents. The confrontation represented both an economic and strategic contest. The Tyrrhenian Sea was vital for trade, resource transport, and territorial influence. The battle itself, although not extensively detailed in surviving records, resulted in a decisive Greek victory. Etruscan fleets were routed, their control over southern Campania weakened, and access to key maritime trade routes disrupted. Archaeological evidence of destruction layers at coastal sites corroborates this outcome, suggesting both physical and economic consequences for Etruscan settlements. A first interpretive insight emerges. Etruscan dominance was vulnerable to coordinated external resistance, particularly from well-organized maritime powers. The defeat at Cumae demonstrates the limits of military projection, even when backed by substantial resources and urban coordination. The engagement underscored the necessity of integrating naval and land strategies while accounting for rival powers' technological and tactical capabilities. The repercussions extended beyond immediate territorial losses. Cities in southern Latium and Campania gradually shifted allegiance toward Greek colonies, diminishing Etruscan influence over formerly dependent communities. Trade networks were disrupted, reducing the flow of metals, luxury goods, and agricultural surpluses that had underpinned urban prosperity. Tomb assemblages and imported pottery distributions from post-battle layers indicate decreased Greek and Phoenician exchange in previously Etruscan-dominated regions. A second interpretive insight is evident. Economic disruption directly affected political and social stability. Loss of maritime control weakened elite authority, as elites relied on trade wealth to maintain social hierarchy, fund public works, and sponsor religious institutions. The battle thus had cascading effects across civic, religious, and economic spheres. Military organization and strategy adapted in response. Etruscan cities increasingly focused on defensive fortifications along both coastlines and inland positions, reflecting lessons learned from the defeat. Archaeological surveys reveal reinforcement of city walls, watchtowers, and inland supply networks. This shift suggests that the Etruscans emphasized territorial consolidation over further expansion, adjusting strategic priorities to preserve remaining influence. Diplomatic strategies also became more prominent. Evidence of treaties and alliances, inferred from inscriptions and regional settlement patterns, indicates that some Etruscan cities sought cooperative arrangements with Greek colonies to mitigate further losses. These arrangements often involved economic concessions, tribute agreements, or shared access to ports and trade routes. Despite the setback at Cumae, the Etruscans maintained cultural and economic presence in central Italy. Trade continued along inland and northern routes, and elite tombs still display imported Greek goods. However, the psychological and political impact of the defeat was lasting. It marked the beginning of a gradual contraction of Etruscan influence in southern Italy and signaled the rising prominence of Greek power in the region. A third interpretive insight follows. Military defeat reshaped strategic priorities and reinforced adaptive governance. Etruscan city-states demonstrated resilience by shifting focus to internal cohesion, defensive infrastructure, and selective alliances, but the battle highlighted limits that would become increasingly consequential in subsequent conflicts with Rome. By the mid-5th century BCE, the consequences of Cumae set the stage for a more challenging geopolitical environment. Etruscan cities faced the dual pressures of diminished southern influence and the emergence of Rome as a regional competitor. This transition would profoundly alter the trajectory of Etruscan political and military activity. Roman power soon followed, gradually supplanting Etruscan influence in Latium and central Italy, and introducing a new phase of conflict and political transformation for the Etruscan city-states. Rome was shaped by Etruscan rulers, whose political, religious, and architectural innovations left a lasting imprint on the city's early development. By the late 6th century BCE, Etruscan influence reached the city of Rome, primarily through the establishment of the Tarquin dynasty. According to Roman literary sources, including Livy and Dionysius of Halicarnassus, Rome was ruled by a series of kings from the Etruscan city of Tarquinia, beginning with Tarquinius Priscus and culminating in the reign of Tarquinius Superbus. Archaeological evidence from the Capitoline and Palatine areas corroborates significant urban development during this period, including monumental construction, drainage works, and fortifications, consistent with Etruscan engineering expertise. The Tarquin kings introduced political and administrative structures that reflected Etruscan models of governance. They strengthened central authority while maintaining elite participation through advisory councils, similar to the aristocratic assemblies observed in Etruscan city-states. Roman magistracies, early legal frameworks, and ceremonial offices bear clear parallels with Etruscan institutions, indicating that urban consolidation and hierarchical governance were influenced by imported administrative practices. Etruscan influence extended to religious and ceremonial life. The practice of augury, haruspicy, and other forms of divination in Rome can be traced to Etruscan ritual expertise. Sacred spaces, including temples and altars, were constructed in accordance with Etruscan religious conventions, emphasizing cosmological alignment and ritual precision. These innovations not only structured civic life but also reinforced the divine legitimacy of ruling elites. Architecture and urban planning provide tangible evidence of this influence. The construction of Rome's Cloaca Maxima drainage system, city walls, and monumental buildings reflects engineering techniques consistent with Etruscan practice. Tomb and votive evidence demonstrates continuity in material culture, suggesting that imported craftsmanship and building methods were integrated into Roman development. A first interpretive insight emerges. Etruscan rulers facilitated urban and institutional sophistication, enabling Rome to evolve from a collection of hilltop settlements into a centralized city capable of political coordination, economic management, and ritual administration. This period set the structural foundation for Rome's subsequent expansion. Economic activity was also influenced by Etruscan presence. Tarquinian connections strengthened access to trade networks, including coastal and riverine routes linking Rome to Etruria and the broader Mediterranean. Control of metal supplies, agricultural surpluses, and artisanal production enhanced both elite wealth and civic resources, embedding Rome within regional economic circuits dominated by Etruscan expertise. However, the concentration of authority under the Tarquins provoked tensions. Roman elites, particularly the patrician families, increasingly resisted Etruscan domination. Literary sources recount that the final king, Tarquinius Superbus, ruled with authoritarian measures, bypassing traditional consultation mechanisms and relying on fear and force to maintain control. This centralization of power, while effective in the short term, created social and political friction. A second interpretive insight follows. Etruscan political models were adaptable but potentially destabilizing. Imported practices enhanced efficiency and urban cohesion, but also introduced elite centralized structures that conflicted with emerging Roman expectations of shared governance. The resulting tension contributed directly to the eventual overthrow of the monarchy. Cultural transmission extended to ceremonial symbolism and public spectacle. Etruscan influence on triumphal processions, religious festivals, and urban iconography reinforced the political legitimacy of rulers while embedding civic identity within a broader Etruscan framework. Artifacts from this period, including terracotta and bronze objects, indicate stylistic continuity with central Etruria, highlighting the extent of cultural integration. By the end of the 6th century BCE, Etruscan authority in Rome had facilitated institutional, religious, and architectural transformation, establishing models for governance, ritual, and urban planning that would persist into the Republican era. Tomb inscriptions, monumental construction, and ritual practices all reflect a period of profound Etruscan imprint. A third interpretive insight is evident. Etruscan contributions to early Rome were structural rather than merely ceremonial, providing the civic and economic framework upon which Roman identity and expansion were later built. This influence provoked Roman resistance, as tensions between Etruscan rulers and Roman elites culminated in the expulsion of the Tarquin kings and the establishment of the Roman Republic, initiating a new phase of conflict and realignment in central Italy. Rome was shaped by Etruscan rulers, whose political, religious, and architectural innovations left a lasting imprint on the city's early development. By the late 6th century BCE, Etruscan influence reached the city of Rome, primarily through the establishment of the Tarquin dynasty. According to Roman literary sources, including Livy and Dionysius of Halicarnassus, Rome was ruled by a series of kings from the Etruscan city of Tarquinia, beginning with Tarquinius Priscus and culminating in the reign of Tarquinius Superbus. Archaeological evidence from the Capitoline and Palatine areas corroborates significant urban development during this period, including monumental construction, drainage works, and fortifications, consistent with Etruscan engineering expertise. The Tarquin kings introduced political and administrative structures that reflected Etruscan models of governance. They strengthened central authority while maintaining elite participation through advisory councils, similar to the aristocratic assemblies observed in Etruscan city-states. Roman magistracies, early legal frameworks, and ceremonial offices bear clear parallels with Etruscan institutions, indicating that urban consolidation and hierarchical governance were influenced by imported administrative practices. Etruscan influence extended to religious and ceremonial life. The practice of augury, haruspicy, and other forms of divination in Rome can be traced to Etruscan ritual expertise. Sacred spaces, including temples and altars, were constructed in accordance with Etruscan religious conventions, emphasizing cosmological alignment and ritual precision. These innovations not only structured civic life but also reinforced the divine legitimacy of ruling elites. Architecture and urban planning provide tangible evidence of this influence. The construction of Rome's Cloaca Maxima drainage system, city walls, and monumental buildings reflects engineering techniques consistent with Etruscan practice. Tomb and votive evidence demonstrates continuity in material culture, suggesting that imported craftsmanship and building methods were integrated into Roman development. A first interpretive insight emerges. Etruscan rulers facilitated urban and institutional sophistication, enabling Rome to evolve from a collection of hilltop settlements into a centralized city capable of political coordination, economic management, and ritual administration. This period set the structural foundation for Rome's subsequent expansion. Economic activity was also influenced by Etruscan presence. Tarquinian connections strengthened access to trade networks, including coastal and riverine routes linking Rome to Etruria and the broader Mediterranean. Control of metal supplies, agricultural surpluses, and artisanal production enhanced both elite wealth and civic resources, embedding Rome within regional economic circuits dominated by Etruscan expertise. However, the concentration of authority under the Tarquins provoked tensions. Roman elites, particularly the patrician families, increasingly resisted Etruscan domination. Literary sources recount that the final king, Tarquinius Superbus, ruled with authoritarian measures, bypassing traditional consultation mechanisms and relying on fear and force to maintain control. This centralization of power, while effective in the short term, created social and political friction. A second interpretive insight follows. Etruscan political models were adaptable but potentially destabilizing. Imported practices enhanced efficiency and urban cohesion, but also introduced elite centralized structures that conflicted with emerging Roman expectations of shared governance. The resulting tension contributed directly to the eventual overthrow of the monarchy. Cultural transmission extended to ceremonial symbolism and public spectacle. Etruscan influence on triumphal processions, religious festivals, and urban iconography reinforced the political legitimacy of rulers while embedding civic identity within a broader Etruscan framework. Artifacts from this period, including terracotta and bronze objects, indicate stylistic continuity with central Etruria, highlighting the extent of cultural integration. By the end of the 6th century BCE, Etruscan authority in Rome had facilitated institutional, religious, and architectural transformation, establishing models for governance, ritual, and urban planning that would persist into the Republican era. Tomb inscriptions, monumental construction, and ritual practices all reflect a period of profound Etruscan imprint. A third interpretive insight is evident. Etruscan contributions to early Rome were structural rather than merely ceremonial, providing the civic and economic framework upon which Roman identity and expansion were later built. This influence provoked Roman resistance, as tensions between Etruscan rulers and Roman elites culminated in the expulsion of the Tarquin kings and the establishment of the Roman Republic, initiating a new phase of conflict and realignment in central Italy. Rome learned from the civilization it replaced, adapting Etruscan political, military, and urban models while asserting control over central Italy. Following the expulsion of the Tarquin kings in 509 BCE, Rome emerged as a nascent republic with a clear objective: securing dominance over Latium and the surrounding Etruscan cities. The wars with Veii, one of the most powerful Etruscan city-states, exemplify this process. Archaeological surveys and literary sources, particularly Livy and Dionysius of Halicarnassus, document repeated conflicts culminating in the Siege of Veii, c. 396 BCE, a protracted campaign that combined engineering, attrition, and logistical coordination. The Roman approach reflected adaptation and learning from Etruscan precedent. The organization of Roman legions, siege techniques, and urban administration drew on models observed in Etruscan warfare and civic structures. Tomb reliefs, fortification remains, and battlefield archaeology indicate that Romans implemented both military and logistical innovations, integrating Etruscan knowledge into their expanding military apparatus. Veii's capture demonstrates the systematic nature of Roman expansion. The city, located on the Tiber's right bank, had controlled critical trade routes, fertile lands, and access to riverine transport. Roman engineers constructed siege works, including ramparts, trenches, and tunnels, to overcome formidable defenses, highlighting the application of both strategic planning and technical skill. Following the city's fall, Romans redistributed land to settlers, secured trade routes, and imposed political oversight, consolidating their authority in the region. A first interpretive insight emerges. Roman success depended on selective emulation and adaptation of Etruscan systems. Military organization, urban infrastructure, and administrative mechanisms were incorporated into Roman practice, allowing a relatively small state to overcome larger, well-established Etruscan cities. Political displacement extended beyond Veii. Other Etruscan cities, including Tarquinia, Caere, and Volsci, gradually lost autonomy through a combination of military pressure, strategic alliances, and incorporation into Roman hegemony. Inscriptions and settlement patterns indicate that Rome installed client elites or exerted influence via tribute, demonstrating a blend of coercion and accommodation. Economic integration followed military conquest. Roman control over Etruscan territories secured agricultural surplus, metal resources, and trade hubs, bolstering urban growth and sustaining military operations. Archaeological finds, such as Romanized pottery and coinage, illustrate the assimilation of material culture while highlighting continuity of local production and exchange networks. A second interpretive insight is evident. Conquest facilitated systemic incorporation rather than total cultural erasure. While political dominance shifted to Rome, Etruscan urban planning, religious practice, and artisanal expertise persisted, shaping the evolving landscape of Roman society. Roads, temples, and administrative structures retained Etruscan features even under Roman oversight. Resistance remained localized but ultimately ineffective. Fortified hilltop settlements delayed but did not prevent Roman expansion, reflecting the strategic advantage provided by Rome's combination of military innovation, logistic capacity, and political adaptability. Classical sources describe repeated campaigns and sieges, emphasizing the protracted and methodical nature of conquest. By the mid-4th century BCE, Etruscan political cohesion had significantly weakened. The fragmentation of the Dodecapolis, combined with loss of military initiative and economic leverage, signaled the decline of Etruscan influence in central Italy. Archaeological evidence shows reduced monumental construction, shifting burial practices, and diminished participation in Mediterranean trade networks, illustrating both material and symbolic consequences of Roman ascendancy. A third interpretive insight follows. Roman expansion catalyzed the fragmentation of traditional Etruscan power structures, undermining the political, economic, and religious networks that had previously sustained regional influence. Local elites either assimilated into the Roman system or retreated to smaller, less autonomous centers. By the end of the 4th century BCE, the transformation was largely complete. Etruscan cities retained cultural and ritual significance, but political authority and territorial control were firmly in Roman hands. This shift established the framework for Rome's unchallenged expansion throughout central Italy. Etruscan power fragmented, setting the stage for the final stages of urban decline, cultural transformation, and integration into the Roman world, marking the transition from independent civilization to provincial incorporation. Etruscan culture reached its fullest expression, producing art and architecture that combined technical mastery with civic and religious purpose. During the 5th and early 4th centuries BCE, Etruria experienced a period of remarkable artistic and architectural achievement. Urban centers such as Tarquinia, Veii, and Vulci showcased monumental public works, while tombs and sanctuaries displayed exceptional craftsmanship in bronze, terracotta, and painted decoration. Archaeological evidence from necropolises, temples, and civic structures highlights both the scale and sophistication of Etruscan material culture. Bronze sculpture exemplifies technical innovation. Artifacts include life-size statues, ritual objects, and decorative elements, produced using the lost wax casting method. The Apollo of Veii, a terracotta statue over 2 meters tall, demonstrates dynamic movement, detailed anatomy, and expressive composition, reflecting both religious dedication and elite patronage. Workshops specialized in bronze production coordinated labor, raw materials, and artistic design, illustrating an advanced division of labor and economic organization. Etruscan architecture similarly reflects ingenuity. Temples, particularly those at Veii and Tarquinia, employed wooden superstructures, terracotta roof tiles, and sculpted antefixes, forming a distinctive regional style. Foundations and podiums were constructed from stone, while decorative elements incorporated mythological motifs and civic symbolism. Archaeological remains indicate careful urban planning, integrating sacred, residential, and public spaces within city layouts. Fresco painting and tomb decoration provide insight into cultural values and social structure. Murals in Tarquinia's necropolises depict banquets, athletic competitions, and ceremonial processions, emphasizing elite participation and communal identity. The preservation of color and detail allows scholars to analyze costume, gestures, and symbolic imagery, offering direct evidence of Etruscan aesthetics and ritual practice. A first interpretive insight emerges. Artistic production reinforced social hierarchy and civic ideology. Luxurious tombs, monumental temples, and public sculptures were not only expressions of aesthetic skill, but also instruments of political and religious authority. Elite families commissioned works that demonstrated status, reinforced lineage, and codified communal memory. Technological innovation underpinned these achievements. Metallurgical expertise, gained through extensive mining and workshop networks, enabled the creation of durable bronze works. Terracotta production required standardized molds, kiln management, and clay sourcing, reflecting organized production systems. Urban planning and temple construction demonstrate knowledge of geometry, hydraulics, and load-bearing engineering. Trade and external interaction influenced artistic development. Greek motifs, Phoenician materials, and Mediterranean iconography were selectively incorporated, creating a hybrid style that remained distinctly Etruscan. Imported luxury items were often adapted for local tastes, while Etruscan artisans developed unique conventions in proportion, narrative composition, and decorative motifs. A second interpretive insight is evident. Cultural flourishing was both locally rooted and cosmopolitan, integrating indigenous traditions with imported influences to produce a coherent, recognizable aesthetic identity. This synthesis reinforced social cohesion while signaling participation in broader Mediterranean cultural networks. Elite patronage sustained artistic production. Tombs, temples, and public works required substantial resources, linking economic capacity to cultural output. Excavated inscriptions and votive offerings confirm that civic and religious sponsorship was centralized among prominent families, intertwining cultural achievement with political authority. Despite this period of flourishing, underlying instability persisted. Political rivalries, competition between city-states, and pressures from rising powers, such as Rome and Greek colonies, gradually undermined security. Nevertheless, the cultural record from this peak period reflects a deliberate investment in monumental and artistic expression, leaving an enduring legacy for subsequent Roman appropriation and adaptation. A third interpretive insight follows. Artistic and architectural achievement functioned as both celebration and assertion of civic identity, codifying social structures and religious ideology even as external pressures increased. This dual role highlights the strategic function of material culture in sustaining elite authority and collective cohesion. By the early 4th century BCE, Etruscan cities had produced a corpus of art and architecture unrivaled in central Italy. Bronze sculptures, terracotta temples, and painted tombs testify to technical skill, aesthetic sensibility, and organized urban development, marking a high point in Etruscan civilization. This flourishing masked growing instability as political, military, and economic pressures began to challenge the cohesion and resilience of Etruscan society, setting the stage for eventual decline. Writing preserved identity amid change, enabling the Etruscans to codify ritual, record transactions, and assert civic memory. Etruscan literacy and intellectual activity developed alongside urbanization and cultural flourishing, reaching their zenith during the 5th and early 4th centuries BCE. The Etruscan alphabet, derived from a Western Greek script, facilitated writing for religious, administrative, and commercial purposes. Inscriptions on tombs, votive offerings, bronze mirrors, and public monuments provide direct evidence of both the practical and symbolic roles of literacy within Etruscan society. Education, while limited to elites, emphasized mastery of religious texts, civic rituals, and administrative procedures. Young aristocrats learned to read and interpret inscriptions, conduct divination, and manage legal and economic documentation. The ability to record transactions, treaties, and genealogies reinforced social hierarchy and political authority, ensuring continuity across generations. Tomb inscriptions often highlight familial lineage, civic status, and professional accomplishments, illustrating the intersection of literacy, identity, and social prestige. Record-keeping extended to trade and industry. Etruscan merchants, metalworkers, and civic administrators utilized inscriptions to document contracts, ownership, and production quantities. Examples include bronze and ceramic labels, tally marks, and dedications, which indicate both internal organization and participation in wider Mediterranean commercial networks. Literacy thus supported economic integration and facilitated interaction with Greek, Phoenician, and other trading partners. Religious texts and ritual manuals reflect the integration of writing into spiritual and civic life. The Liber Linteus, preserved through later Roman reuse as mummy wrappings in Egypt, contains detailed ritual instructions, prayers, and calendrical information. This extraordinary artifact demonstrates the sophistication of Etruscan ceremonial knowledge and the centrality of writing in codifying and transmitting sacred practices. A first interpretive insight emerges. Literacy reinforced cultural identity and institutional continuity. Written records allowed the Etruscans to assert communal cohesion, codify religious observances, and preserve elite lineage, even amid external pressures and shifting political circumstances. Writing functioned as both a practical tool and a marker of social authority. Public inscriptions on sanctuaries, temples, and civic buildings further illustrate the symbolic function of literacy. Dedications, official decrees, and votive texts conveyed messages of political legitimacy, piety, and communal participation. Archaeological evidence from urban centers such as Tarquinia, Veii, and Caera demonstrates the proliferation of inscribed monuments, signaling the integration of intellectual activity into civic life. Interaction with neighboring cultures shaped intellectual development. Greek influence introduced literary conventions, administrative techniques, and numeracy systems, which were adapted to local needs. Phoenician and Euboean connections provided additional models for script usage, economic recording, and diplomatic documentation. Yet, despite these external inputs, Etruscan writing remained linguistically and culturally distinct, preserving a non-Indo-European identity within a multilingual environment. A second interpretive insight is evident. Intellectual life balanced adaptation and preservation, allowing the Etruscans to absorb external influences while maintaining a distinct cultural and linguistic identity. This capacity for selective integration underscores the strategic role of literacy in societal resilience. The decline of Etruscan autonomy, however, constrained intellectual activity. As Rome expanded into central Italy, control over administrative centers, trade routes, and elite resources shifted. Inscriptions and written records become less frequent after the 4th century BCE, reflecting both population displacement and the reorientation of political and economic systems under Roman dominance. A third interpretive insight follows. Literacy served as both cultural bulwark and indicator of autonomy. The presence of extensive written material corresponds with periods of political stability and civic self-determination, while its reduction signals erosion of independent governance. By the late 5th and early 4th centuries BCE, Etruscan intellectual life had produced a sophisticated system of writing, record-keeping, and ritual codification. Inscriptions, manuals, and civic texts preserved social, religious, and economic knowledge, reinforcing identity even as external pressures undermined political independence. But political autonomy was eroding as Roman expansion, military pressure, and internal fragmentation increasingly challenged the cohesion and authority of Etruscan city-states. Unity never meant uniformity. Etruscan civilization encompassed a mosaic of city-states, each with distinct political structures, economic strategies, and cultural practices. Despite shared language, religious conventions, and artistic styles, Etruria was far from homogeneous. Tarquinia, Veii, Cerveteri, Vulci, and Caera each developed unique institutional frameworks and social hierarchies, reflecting local geography, resource availability, and historical circumstance. Archaeological surveys reveal variations in urban layout, fortification design, and necropolis organization, demonstrating that regional adaptation was central to Etruscan urbanism. Economic specialization differed among city-states. Populonia, located on the Tyrrhenian coast, dominated metal extraction and maritime trade, particularly iron from Elba and copper from northern mines. Tarquinia and Cerveteri, by contrast, focused on agriculture, artisanal production, and inland trade networks, leveraging fertile plains and river access. These distinctions shaped wealth distribution, elite influence, and the organization of civic resources, creating divergent patterns of urban development and social structure. Religious and ritual practices, while following a common pantheon, displayed regional variation. Temple architecture, sacrificial customs, and votive iconography differed among cities, reflecting localized interpretations of shared beliefs. Tomb paintings and grave goods vary markedly, signaling differences in elite patronage, funerary ideology, and social priorities. These distinctions underscore the capacity for cultural unity to coexist with localized expression. A first interpretive insight emerges. Regional diversity strengthened internal resilience while complicating collective action. Distinct economic bases and political structures allowed city-states to exploit local advantages and maintain prosperity, but coordination across Etruria required negotiation and compromise. The League of 12 Cities facilitated religious cohesion, yet political or military cooperation remained limited and episodic. Military organization and defensive strategies further illustrate diversity. Veii emphasized robust fortifications and urban militia deployment, while Tarquinia relied on naval capabilities and alliances to project power. Such differences indicate that strategic priorities were tailored to environmental and economic contexts, rather than imposed uniformly across Etruria. This specialization optimized local effectiveness but limited the capacity for coordinated regional response to external threats. Artistic expression and material culture also reflect local variation. Tomb decoration, bronze sculpture, and pottery styles differ in motif, scale, and technique among cities. Regional workshops produce distinct interpretations of shared iconography, balancing communal identity with local aesthetics. Trade and diplomatic exchange facilitated diffusion of styles, but variation persisted, highlighting a dynamic interplay between unity and individuality. A second interpretive insight is evident. Cultural cohesion coexisted with localized innovation, allowing Etruscan city-states to maintain identity while experimenting with architectural, artistic, and administrative forms. This adaptive flexibility contributed to resilience during periods of stability but hindered rapid collective action in times of crisis. Political fragmentation had strategic consequences. Competing interests among city-states occasionally led to interurban conflict or rivalry, undermining unified response to external pressures. Archaeological evidence of contested fortifications, boundary markers, and shifting settlement patterns suggests that internal competition could exacerbate vulnerability to expanding powers such as Rome and Greek colonies. A third interpretive insight follows. Regional diversity, while advantageous for localized prosperity, weakened coordinated resistance. The inability to present a united front against external threats allowed Rome to exploit divisions, gradually incorporating Etruscan territories into its growing republic. Economic, cultural, and military differences, once sources of innovation, became liabilities in the face of strategic conquest. By the early 4th century BCE, Etruria exhibited a complex mosaic of culturally connected but politically distinct cities. Each city-state pursued its own trajectory, balancing shared identity with local priorities. Archaeological, epigraphic, and material evidence collectively illustrate the richness of this regional diversity. This fragmentation weakened resistance, making Etruscan cities increasingly vulnerable to Roman expansion and contributing to the gradual erosion of political, military, and economic independence across central Italy. Etruscan decline was gradual, marked by the erosion of political cohesion and the weakening of economic networks that had sustained city-state prosperity for centuries. By the 4th century BCE, the Etruscan city-states faced mounting internal and external pressures. Politically, the Dodecapolis no longer functioned as a cohesive league. Coordination among cities had weakened, and local elites increasingly pursued independent agendas. Archaeological evidence shows fortified settlements and defensive works concentrated around core urban centers, suggesting heightened concern for local security rather than regional cooperation. Tomb inscriptions indicate that familial and civic prestige was increasingly localized, emphasizing individual city identities over collective Etruscan authority. Economic strain compounded political fragmentation. Control over Mediterranean trade routes had declined following repeated setbacks against Greek colonies and Roman competitors. The destruction of coastal trade hubs, such as Perge and Gravisca, limited access to critical imports, including luxury goods, metals, and maritime resources. Archaeological surveys document a reduction in imported pottery and bronze artifacts in Etruria during this period, indicating decreased commercial activity and disrupted exchange networks. Agricultural and metallurgical production, previously key to sustaining urban elites, faced pressures from population displacement and warfare. Excavations reveal a contraction of rural settlements and a decline in large-scale workshop activity, suggesting that both labor and raw materials were increasingly constrained. This contraction diminished surplus output, undermining the financial foundations that had supported monumental construction, civic patronage, and military mobilization. A first interpretive insight emerges. Political and economic fragmentation were mutually reinforcing. As city-states prioritized local interests and defensive posturing, regional coordination weakened, further restricting access to trade and reducing collective capacity to mobilize resources against external threats. The decline of centralized economic networks directly limited the ability of Etruscan elites to project power or sustain urban infrastructure. Military organization also suffered under these conditions. Citizen militias, once capable of coordinated campaigns across central Italy, were increasingly focused on defending individual city territories. Archaeological evidence of hastily constructed fortifications and internal barriers suggests reactive rather than strategic defense. Loss of regional cohesion inhibited joint military campaigns, leaving Etruscan cities vulnerable to Roman and Latin incursions. Diplomatic strategies shifted in response to this decline. Some cities sought alliances with Rome or other neighboring powers to preserve autonomy or protect trade interests. Epigraphic records and settlement patterns indicate a reliance on clientage, tribute, and negotiated settlements rather than independent projection of authority. While these arrangements mitigated immediate threats, they also reinforced dependence on emerging powers and eroded political sovereignty. A second interpretive insight is evident. Economic contraction and loss of external leverage accelerated political vulnerability. Cities that once dominated trade and regional alliances found themselves subordinated within emerging geopolitical structures, particularly under Roman ascendancy. The decline of long-standing commercial networks weakened urban elites' authority and reduced the resources available for public works and cultural patronage. Cultural and religious life persisted but reflected the changing political landscape. Temples and civic sanctuaries continued to function, though inscriptions and votive offerings indicate a decline in scale and frequency. This continuity underscores the resilience of social and religious traditions, even as political and economic power waned, highlighting the partial persistence of civic identity amidst structural decline. A third interpretive insight follows. Institutional and cultural persistence coexisted with structural weakness, illustrating that while Etruscan identity endured in ritual, artistic, and urban forms, the underlying mechanisms of political and economic power had eroded, leaving cities increasingly vulnerable to conquest and absorption. By the early 4th century BCE, Etruscan cities faced fragmentation, diminishing trade, and internal competition, setting the stage for intensified Roman intervention. Political autonomy and economic vitality, once the pillars of Etruscan regional influence, had been substantially undermined, creating conditions for external domination. Roman pressure intensified, exploiting these vulnerabilities and accelerating the absorption of Etruscan territories into the expanding Roman Republic, marking a decisive shift in central Italian power dynamics. Etruria became Roman territory, as centuries of independent city-state power gave way to the expanding Roman Republic. By the late 4th and early 3rd centuries BCE, Roman military campaigns decisively reshaped the political landscape of central Italy. Etruscan cities, weakened by internal fragmentation and economic strain, were increasingly unable to resist Roman legions. The siege of Veii, 396 BCE, chronicled by Livy, exemplifies the systematic approach employed by Rome. Prolonged encirclement, cutting of supply lines, and coordinated assault, ultimately resulting in complete military subjugation. Subsequent campaigns targeted Tarquinia, Caere, and Volsci, incorporating each city into Roman spheres of influence, either through conquest or negotiated submission. Archaeological evidence corroborates this process. Layers of destruction in urban centers, the abrupt cessation of monumental construction, and the reduction of independent fortifications indicate both the physical and administrative consequences of Roman military success. Settlements previously oriented toward trade and regional projection were restructured to align with Roman priorities, including road construction, garrison placement, and redistribution of land to Roman colonists or allied elites. Integration extended beyond military occupation. Rome systematically extended citizenship and legal frameworks to incorporated populations, creating a model of conditional assimilation. Some Etruscan elites were granted Roman citizenship, permitting participation in the political, economic, and military structures of the Republic. Inscriptions and epigraphic records reveal the gradual Romanization of administrative offices, religious duties, and civic responsibilities, while still preserving certain local customs and temple functions. A first interpretive insight emerges. Roman integration balanced coercion with accommodation. Military defeat alone was insufficient. Rome incorporated Etruscan elites into civic structures, leveraging their local knowledge, economic networks, and social influence to stabilize newly conquered territories. This strategy facilitated smoother political transition and reduced the likelihood of revolt. Economic and infrastructural assimilation followed military conquest. Roads such as the Via Cassia connected Etruscan cities to Rome and other strategic locations, facilitating troop movement, commerce, and communication. Trade networks were reorganized under Roman oversight, ensuring resource flows aligned with republic-wide economic objectives. Archaeological findings of Roman-style workshops, coinage, and administrative centers indicate systematic integration into broader Roman systems. Religious and cultural life was partially maintained but increasingly syncretized. Temples continued to function, often repurposed to align with Roman practices. Augury, haruspicy, and local cults persisted, but their civic significance was gradually redefined within the context of Roman religious authority. Funerary practices evolved, blending traditional Etruscan forms with Roman customs, demonstrating the selective preservation of identity within an imposed political framework. A second interpretive insight is evident. Integration fostered cultural continuity while establishing political dominance. Rome's approach preserved elements of Etruscan identity, allowing for gradual assimilation rather than abrupt eradication, ensuring that local elites and populations retained vested interest in the new order. Military integration also transformed Etruscan society. Enlisted men joined Roman legions, contributing manpower while adopting Roman military organization and discipline. This incorporation facilitated both the expansion of Roman power and the absorption of Etruscan martial expertise. Archaeological evidence of standardized weaponry, armor, and fortification techniques reflects the diffusion of Roman military norms throughout previously independent city-states. A third interpretive insight follows. Roman conquest reshaped Etruscan social and military structures, creating a framework in which former adversaries became participants in Roman political, economic, and military systems. This transformation highlights the strategic efficacy of combining force with institutional assimilation. By the mid-3rd century BCE, the Etruscan city-states were effectively incorporated into the Roman Republic. While political autonomy had ended, cultural traditions, language, art, religious practice, persisted in adapted forms, providing a foundation for continued influence within the Roman world. Cultural survival took new forms, as Etruscan traditions were preserved, transformed, and absorbed into Roman civic, religious, and artistic practices, ensuring that the legacy of the civilization endured beyond its political demise. A language faded, but not its influence. Etruscan ceased as a spoken medium, yet its cultural and linguistic imprint persisted within Roman society. By the late 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, the Etruscan language, once widely used across central Italy, had begun a marked decline. Literary and epigraphic evidence indicates a gradual reduction in the production of inscriptions, formal records, and public texts written in Etruscan. Urban centers such as Tarquinia, Veii, and Caere increasingly employed Latin for official, commercial, and administrative purposes, reflecting the expanding reach of Roman political authority and cultural dominance. The process of linguistic assimilation was closely tied to political and social integration. Roman institutions required Latin for legal documentation, civic participation, and military administration. Etruscan elites, now incorporated into Roman structures, adopted Latin to maintain status and influence, while common populations gradually shifted in daily communication. Inscriptions from funerary, religious, and dedicatory contexts show bilingual practices initially, with Latin progressively supplanting Etruscan by the 2nd century BCE. A first interpretive insight emerges. Language loss often parallels political subjugation and administrative centralization. As Etruscan city-states were incorporated into the Roman Republic, linguistic assimilation reinforced the authority of Roman institutions, enabling standardized governance while reducing the autonomy of local elites. Despite declining everyday usage, Etruscan exerted a lasting influence on Latin vocabulary and Roman ritual terminology. Words associated with religion, divination, and civic office, such as augur, haruspex, and faz, derive directly from Etruscan origins. This linguistic legacy demonstrates the selective transmission of specialized knowledge, particularly in areas of ritual, administration, and culture where Etruscan expertise had been highly developed. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence, including funerary inscriptions and votive dedications, indicates that literacy in Etruscan persisted longer in religious and ceremonial contexts than in secular life. Certain sanctuaries and private tombs continued to employ Etruscan writing for ritual precision, even as the spoken language diminished. This selective retention underscores the cultural significance of literacy as a medium of identity and continuity. A second interpretive insight is evident. Language can survive symbolically even as spoken use declines. The retention of Etruscan in sacred and elite contexts highlights its role as a marker of identity, authority, and technical knowledge, even amid widespread linguistic shift toward Latin. By the 1st century BCE, the Etruscan language had largely ceased as a living tongue. Bilingual inscriptions became rare, and literacy in Etruscan was confined to specialized contexts, such as ritual manuals or funerary formulae. Nonetheless, the structural, lexical, and ritual contributions of Etruscan persisted, integrated into Roman civic, religious, and artistic frameworks. Scholars note that Roman adoption of Etruscan symbols, urban models, and administrative vocabulary reflects the deep imprint left by the language even after its practical use had ended. A third interpretive insight follows. Linguistic disappearance does not equate to cultural erasure. While Etruscan ceased to be spoken, its conceptual frameworks, terminology, and intellectual traditions were embedded within Roman culture, enabling the civilization's influence to endure through adaptation rather than direct continuity. Material culture further illustrates this persistence. Roman inscriptions, architecture, and urban organization incorporated Etruscan precedents, demonstrating that structural and symbolic aspects of civilization often outlast the spoken word. Even as Latin became dominant, Etruscan techniques in temple construction, divination practices, and civic ritual informed the developing Roman state. By the late Republic, Etruscan was effectively extinct as a daily language. Its disappearance marked the culmination of centuries-long political, economic, and social assimilation into Roman structures. Nevertheless, the enduring legacy of Etruscan linguistic, religious, and civic innovations continued to shape Roman identity and practice. Their legacy endured through Rome, preserved in architecture, ritual, political organization, and cultural practices, ensuring that Etruscan civilization influenced the Mediterranean world long after its language had vanished. The Etruscans were rediscovered underground, as modern archaeology brought to light the material foundations of a civilization once thought lost. Systematic study of Etruscan civilization began in earnest in the 18th and 19th centuries, coinciding with broader European interest in classical antiquity. Early excavations targeted necropolises, hilltop settlements, and temples, revealing a wealth of material culture that had remained buried for over a millennium. Sites such as Tarquinia, Cerveteri, Veii, and Veii yielded monumental tombs, frescoed chambers, and inscribed artifacts, providing direct evidence of social structure, ritual practice, and urban organization. Tombs played a central role in reconstructing Etruscan society. Excavations revealed complex subterranean chambers, often with multiple rooms, elaborately decorated walls, and sarcophagi bearing inscriptions. The Regolini Galassi tomb in Cerveteri, dating to the 7th century BCE, contained gold jewelry, bronze vessels, and imported luxury goods, illustrating elite wealth, long-distance trade, and craftsmanship. Similarly, painted tombs at Tarquinia, with depictions of banquets, athletic competitions, and religious rituals, offered visual documentation of social life, gender roles, and ceremonial priorities. Archaeological methods evolved over time, from treasure-focused excavation to systematic stratigraphy, contextual recording, and scientific analysis. Modern techniques, including radiocarbon dating, GIS mapping, and petrographic analysis, allow precise chronological reconstruction of settlement sequences, trade networks, and production techniques. Studies of pottery, metallurgy, and architectural remains provide insight into technological capacity, economic organization, and cultural interaction across central Italy and the wider Mediterranean. A first interpretive insight emerges. Archaeology transformed understanding of Etruscan society from myth and literary speculation to empirically grounded knowledge. Inscriptions, artifacts, and settlement patterns provide evidence of complex urban planning, political hierarchies, and cultural continuity, challenging earlier assumptions that portrayed the Etruscans as peripheral or derivative. Artifacts also illustrate interaction with neighboring civilizations. Greek ceramics, Phoenician luxury goods, and bronze imports demonstrate the integration of Etruria into Mediterranean exchange networks. Metallurgical workshops, mining sites, and harbor infrastructure confirm extensive economic activity and suggest sophisticated knowledge of resource management. These discoveries illuminate the strategic and economic factors that underpinned Etruscan prosperity. Interpretation of Etruscan religious practice is heavily informed by archaeological evidence. Temple remains, votive offerings, and ritual implements provide a tangible record of divine observance. The liver of Piacenza, a bronze model of a sheep's liver used for haruspicy, exemplifies the precision and codification of religious knowledge, linking material culture to social and political structures. Epigraphy contributes further clarity. Thousands of inscriptions on tombs, mirrors, pottery, and public monuments preserve personal names, genealogies, civic titles, and dedicatory formulas. While the Etruscan language remains only partially understood, these texts permit reconstruction of social organization, elite lineages, and patterns of civic engagement. Inscriptions indicate the persistence of religious and legal practice across centuries, highlighting the role of literacy in sustaining institutional continuity. A second interpretive insight is evident. Material culture and inscriptions provide a multidimensional understanding of Etruscan life, encompassing political authority, social hierarchy, economic activity, and religious observance. This evidence enables historians to reconstruct complex societal dynamics with a level of specificity unattainable from literary sources alone. Archaeological rediscovery also illuminates regional diversity. Variations in tomb architecture, urban layout, and artistic style across Veii, Tarquinia, Vulci, and other centers reflect localized adaptation within a shared cultural framework. Stratigraphic analysis and comparative studies reveal differential patterns of wealth, craft specialization, and political structure, confirming that Etruria was a mosaic of interrelated yet distinct city-states. Finally, the cumulative body of archaeological evidence has prompted reassessment of Etruscan chronology and historical significance. Radiocarbon dating, dendrochronology, and cross-cultural comparison have refined timelines for urbanization, trade, and artistic production. Excavated material underscores the sophistication of Etruscan society and its lasting influence on Rome, challenging earlier historiographical narratives that minimized the civilization's contributions. A third interpretive insight follows. Rediscovery through archaeology has repositioned the Etruscans as central to understanding early Italian history, demonstrating their technological, artistic, and political achievements and clarifying the roots of Roman institutions. By the 21st century, the Etruscans were no longer a lost people. Comprehensive excavations, combined with advanced analytical methods, provide a detailed picture of their cities, cemeteries, workshops, and ritual practices. These findings serve as the foundation for ongoing historical interpretation and scholarly debate. Interpretation followed discovery, as historians and archaeologists synthesized material evidence to reconstruct social, political, and cultural dynamics, paving the way for critical assessment of the Etruscans' historical legacy. Certainty remains elusive. The Etruscans continue to challenge historians, linguists, and archaeologists seeking to understand their origins, language, and societal structures. Modern scholarship confronts the Etruscans with both extensive material evidence and significant interpretive challenges. While archaeology provides abundant artifacts, tombs, and urban remains, key aspects, particularly the origins of the population and the nature of their political organization, remain contested. Herodotus proposed a migration from Lydia in Anatolia, while Dionysius of Halicarnassus argued for indigenous development from metallic populations. Contemporary research, informed by archaeological, linguistic, and genetic studies, largely favors autochthonous development, with evidence of continuity from Villanovan culture settlements through the early Iron Age. Language remains a particularly vexing subject. Etruscan is a non-Indo-European language, preserved primarily in inscriptions, funerary texts, and ritual documents such as the Liber Linteus. Despite decades of study, comprehension is partial, constrained by limited bilingual texts and gaps in grammatical knowledge. Linguists can identify certain vocabulary, onomastics, and formulaic expressions, but broader syntactic and semantic understanding is incomplete. This limitation complicates efforts to reconstruct political thought, legal codes, and literary traditions. A first interpretive insight emerges. Linguistic gaps shape historical interpretation, requiring scholars to rely on material culture, epigraphy, and comparative analysis. While writing offers critical clues, it does not yield a fully articulated view of social, political, or intellectual life, necessitating careful inference from archaeological context. Debates also persist regarding social and political organization. Tomb evidence and inscriptions suggest hierarchical structures, civic magistracies, and urban elites, yet the precise mechanisms of governance, intercity coordination, and decision-making remain uncertain. The nature of the Etruscan League, its political authority versus ceremonial role, continues to be analyzed, with most evidence pointing to religious rather than imperial cohesion. Scholars assess material distribution, fortifications, and settlement hierarchies to infer patterns of influence and power. Economic interpretation faces similar challenges. While trade networks are well documented through imported goods, metals, and ceramics, the mechanisms of production, taxation, and resource allocation are partially speculative. Archaeological indicators such as workshop organization, storage facilities, and harbor infrastructure provide insight, but detailed accounts of commercial regulation and elite oversight remain limited. These gaps illustrate the broader difficulty in reconstructing systemic economic structures in the absence of comprehensive written records. A second interpretive insight is evident. Modern interpretation balances empirical evidence with careful conjecture, ensuring that conclusions remain grounded in verifiable data while acknowledging uncertainty. Scholars emphasize continuity, regional diversity, and external interaction to explain patterns of growth, decline, and cultural persistence without over-reliance on literary sources, which may be biased or mythologized. The integration of interdisciplinary methods has advanced understanding, particularly in genetics and bioarchaeology. Ancient DNA studies reveal population continuity and local adaptation, supporting indigenous origin models. Isotopic and osteological analyses inform nutrition, mobility, and health, providing nuanced insight into daily life and social organization. These methods, combined with traditional excavation and epigraphy, allow a more complete reconstruction of Etruscan society than was possible a century ago. A third interpretive insight follows. Modern methodology highlights the complexity of cultural interpretation, showing that material, linguistic, and biological evidence must be synthesized to approach a holistic understanding of Etruscan civilization. No single dataset suffices, and each type of evidence must be contextualized within broader Mediterranean interactions. Despite uncertainties, scholarly consensus recognizes the Etruscans as highly influential in shaping early Roman culture. Architectural techniques, religious practices, urban planning, metalworking, and elite ideology were transmitted and adapted, leaving a durable imprint. While debates over language and origin persist, material and cultural contributions are undeniable. Inscriptions, tombs, and urban layouts reveal a society sophisticated in organization, artistic expression, and ritual practice, influencing subsequent political and cultural development in Italy. A fourth interpretive insight is evident. Etruscan influence endures independently of complete historical comprehension. Even as origin theories and linguistic interpretation remain contested, the civilization's material, religious, and civic legacy provides measurable evidence of its role in shaping early Mediterranean history. By the 21st century, scholarly debates continue to refine the understanding of Etruscan civilization. New excavations, technological advances, and interdisciplinary research offer incremental clarity, yet certain questions, particularly regarding language, political integration, and the full extent of external influence, remain open. The dynamic nature of research ensures that interpretation evolves alongside evidence, balancing certainty with acknowledgement of remaining gaps. Despite gaps, influence is clear, as Etruscan innovations in urbanism, ritual, art, and governance persisted within the Roman world, securing a lasting legacy that extended well beyond the disappearance of their political autonomy and spoken language. Rome inherited more than territory. It absorbed institutions, rituals, and architectural innovations from the Etruscans, integrating them into the foundations of the Republic and Empire. Etruscan influence on Rome is evident across political, religious, and cultural spheres. Politically, Rome adopted elements of Etruscan kingship, magistracy, and ceremonial authority, particularly during the period of the Tarquin kings, late 7th, early 6th centuries BCE. Civic rituals, inauguration practices, and the symbolic use of fasces and other insignia of office reflect direct borrowing from Etruscan models. Archaeological and literary sources indicate that these practices structured Roman political legitimacy, providing continuity even after the expulsion of the monarchy. Religion demonstrates one of the most enduring aspects of Etruscan influence. Roman divination, augury, and haruspicy derive from Etruscan systems for interpreting divine will. The Liver of Piacenza and other ritual manuals reflect technical knowledge transmitted to Rome, shaping state-sponsored religious observance. Temples and sanctuaries in Rome were constructed following Etruscan architectural norms, including high podiums, frontal orientation, and axial alignment, which became standard features of Roman sacred architecture. The integration of these practices underscores the functional and symbolic role of Etruscan religion in legitimizing civic authority. Urban planning and infrastructure also reflect Etruscan models. The use of grid layouts, drainage systems, and fortifications in early Roman settlements mirrors techniques observed in Veii, Tarquinia, and other Etruscan cities. Road construction, bridge building, and public works continued Etruscan principles of connectivity and civic engineering, facilitating administrative control and trade. Material culture, from terracotta roof tiles to decorative bronze fittings, illustrates aesthetic continuity and technical borrowing. A first interpretive insight emerges. Etruscan contributions shaped core Roman institutions and practices, providing frameworks that persisted long after Etruscan political autonomy ended. Religious, political, and architectural inheritance enabled Rome to consolidate authority efficiently while maintaining symbolic legitimacy rooted in local precedent. Artistic influence is also notable. Roman sculpture, relief, and decorative motifs show clear Etruscan antecedents, particularly in bronze work, funerary iconography, and narrative fresco techniques. Tomb imagery and elite portraiture informed Roman visual culture, transmitting conventions of representation, social status, and ceremonial emphasis. These elements contributed to the development of Roman civic identity and elite culture, blending indigenous Italic, Greek, and Etruscan traditions. Military organization and symbols of power likewise reflect Etruscan precedent. The adoption of elite cavalry, fortified urban centers, and ceremonial military displays mirrors practices observed in Etruscan city-states. This continuity demonstrates both practical adaptation of effective systems and symbolic appropriation to reinforce Roman authority. A second interpretive insight is evident. Cultural and institutional transmission was selective and functional, emphasizing practices that reinforced Roman political, religious, and military cohesion. Rome integrated Etruscan models pragmatically, adapting them to emerging structures while preserving underlying principles of hierarchy, ritual, and urban planning. Linguistic and epigraphic influence, though diminished, persisted in specialized domains. Certain religious and administrative terms retained Etruscan roots, reflecting continuity in technical vocabulary, even as Latin became the dominant spoken and written language. These borrowings highlight the subtle but enduring imprint of Etruscan knowledge within the procedural and ceremonial lexicon of Rome. Economic and trade practices also demonstrate Etruscan legacy. Roman exploitation of metal resources, maritime trade organization, and workshop production show continuity with Etruscan strategies, particularly in northern and central Italy. Urban elites adopted patterns of wealth accumulation, patronage, and display modeled on Etruscan precedents, shaping Roman social structures and elite identity. A third interpretive insight follows. The Etruscans provided both material and conceptual tools for Roman state building, from infrastructure to ritual authority. Their influence was neither superficial nor symbolic alone. It constituted practical knowledge embedded in governance, religion, and cultural norms. By the late Republic and early Empire, Etruscan identity as a distinct civilization had largely dissipated, but its institutional, artistic, and religious imprint persisted. Roman authors, such as Livy and Varro, acknowledged Etruscan contributions to Roman law, augury, and civic ritual, further confirming the perception of continuity. Archaeological evidence supports this textual testimony, illustrating the depth and breadth of Etruscan integration into Roman civic life. The Etruscan legacy endured through Rome, not as an independent political entity, but as a foundational influence on the institutions, religious practices, urban planning, and cultural norms of one of history's most consequential civilizations. Their contributions shaped Roman identity and governance, securing a measure of permanence for a civilization otherwise politically absorbed and linguistically vanished. If you found this journey through Etruscan civilization illuminating, consider subscribing for more in-depth explorations of the ancient world. Every week, we uncover the histories, cultures, and empires that shaped humanity, layer by layer, fact by fact. Hit the bell icon to be the first to watch new episodes, and if you enjoyed this deep dive, give it a like to support evidence-based history storytelling. You can also share your thoughts or favorite Etruscan discoveries in the comments below. Let's continue exploring the past together.